Good evening, night owls, and welcome to Whisper Crowley, the place where stories linger long after the lights go out. Tonight, we prepared chilling tales paired with the soothing sound of rain to ignite your imagination and make your heart race. If you feel the cold creeping in, tap that like button. It helps keep the shadows alive. Tell us in the comments where you're listening from or share the scariest moment that sent shivers down your spine. Don't forget to subscribe. You wouldn't want to miss what lurks in the darkness ahead. The Old Cinema in Indiana. The Old Cinema in Indiana had always been a curiosity for those who lived in the town. It stood at the end of a forgotten street, surrounded by the decaying remnants of a once thriving district. The windows were boarded up, and the doors were chained shut. Yet, there were whispers that if you stood in the right spot at night, you could still hear the faint hum of a projector running, as if the theater refused to die. My name is Jason, and I heard those whispers for years. It was only when I returned to Indiana after years of living elsewhere that the strange allure of the abandoned cinema pulled me in. I was no longer a child, no longer someone who believed in old town ghost stories or tales of lingering spirits. But curiosity got the better of me. One autumn evening, I decided to see for myself what everyone was talking about. The street was eerily quiet, even for a sleepy town like this. I walked slowly toward the cinema, the asphalt beneath my shoes cracked and uneven. The cinema's large, dilapidated sign was barely visible in the fading light, but I could make out the letters, Grandview Theater. It had been a grand place once, but now it was just a hollow shell of its former self. I approached the rusted doors, noting the faint smell of dust and mildew. The air felt thick, heavy with the weight of years of abandonment. Something about the building felt wrong, out of place, like it was holding on to secrets it didn't want to share. The doors were locked, as expected. But the windows, those were my chance. I peered through one, squinting to see anything inside. It was dark, save for a flicker of light coming from the back of the theater. A soft glow that pulsed as if someone had just turned on an old projector. I felt a chill crawl down my spine. Could it be a trick of the light? I wondered. But no, the glow was too steady. And then I saw it. A figure. The outline of a person sitting in one of the back rows. For a moment, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. But the figure didn't move. It simply sat there, staring at the screen, the silhouette so still that it almost seemed part of the darkness itself. I pulled back, heart racing. I wasn't sure what I expected, but it wasn't this. I told myself it was nothing, just a figment of my imagination. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that I was being watched. A few moments passed. The light inside the cinema flickered again. And then I heard something that made my blood run cold. The sound of footsteps, soft but distinct, coming from inside. My hand instinctively reached for my phone, but I paused. I wasn't sure what I would even say if I called someone. The footsteps continued. Then, a sudden sound, a mechanical whirring. The projector. I was sure of it now. The sound of a film starting, of the flickering lights inside the theater. I took a few steps back. But before I could turn to leave, I saw movement from the corner of my eye. The figure in the back row, no longer sitting still. It stood up, slowly, as if in a trance. The figure was not entirely human, its movements unnatural, jerky. It stepped toward the screen, its body elongating with each stride, like it was stretching, twisting, trying to reach for something. A strange, high-pitched sound filled the air, something between a creak and a hum. I could hear it even outside the theater, like the building itself was alive. I backed away, my feet stumbling over the cracked pavement, trying to tear myself away from that haunting image. I reached the end of the street and turned a corner, breathing heavily, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't dare look back. But even as I walked away, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. That someone, was still watching me from the shadows of that cursed cinema. As I walked faster, I could swear I heard the projector's hum again, this time much louder, echoing in my ears. And with it, the faint sound of footsteps, following me. The walk back to my apartment felt longer than it should have. Each street lamp seemed to cast a longer shadow, and every creak of the wind felt like it was whispering secrets I wasn't ready to hear. My mind raced, trying to rationalize what I had just witnessed. There's an explanation for this, I told myself. Maybe someone else is in there, messing around with the projector. It's an old building, after all. Maybe it's just a prank. But the chill that had settled in my chest refused to dissipate. My thoughts kept drifting back to that figure, the way it moved, jerky and unnatural, like it wasn't quite human. My fingers tightened around my keys as I unlocked the door to my apartment, trying to shake off the unease. I sat down on the couch, trying to distract myself. I flicked on the TV, but I couldn't focus. The eerie silence of my apartment, now devoid of the comforting sounds of the outside world, only amplified the buzzing in my head. I should have left the cinema alone. I knew that now. But something inside me, some irrational need, pulled me back. Hours passed. The moon climbed higher in the sky. And just as I was starting to convince myself I was being ridiculous, there came a knock at the door. My heart skipped a beat. I wasn't expecting anyone. I stood up slowly, my legs feeling like lead as I moved toward the door. The knock came again, louder this time. Reluctantly, I peered through the peephole. No one. I opened the door just a crack, half expecting a prankster or maybe some late-night delivery. But there was nothing. Just the cool night air and the quiet street beyond. But then, I noticed something strange. There, on the doorstep, was a single ticket. Old and weathered, the edges curled with age. It looked like it had been there for days, maybe longer, but somehow I hadn't seen it before. What in the world? I bent down to pick it up. The paper felt brittle, like it might disintegrate if I held it too long. The ink was faded but still legible, Grandview Theater 1 admission. My pulse quickened. The cinema. Why was this here? Who had left it? The odd thing was that it wasn't even a modern ticket. It looked like something from decades ago, something from when the theater had been in its prime. I turned it over, hoping to find some clue, but the back was blank. Just the ticket, like a strange relic, mocking me. I didn't know what to do. Part of me wanted to toss it aside, forget about it, but something kept me staring at it. Maybe this is some kind of joke, I thought. Maybe it's a sign. Without thinking, I stuffed the ticket into my pocket and grabbed my coat. I had to go back. I didn't know why, but I couldn't let it go. The strange pull was too strong, and my mind kept replaying the image of the figure, the eerie hum of the projector. I needed answers, even if I wasn't sure I'd like them. I grabbed my flashlight, locked the door behind me, and headed back to the cinema, determined to uncover what was truly going on. As I approached the theater again, the air seemed colder than before, biting at my skin. I stood there for a moment, staring at the darkened windows. The silence was thick, oppressive. The hum of the projector, it was there again, louder now, calling to me, pulling me closer. I walked to the side of the building, where the back door stood slightly ajar. My heart raced as I stepped inside, the air inside the theater thick with the smell of old leather and dust. The light from the projector spilled out from behind a set of heavy curtains at the back of the room, flickering in time with the low hum. I moved closer, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The rows of empty seats were draped in cobwebs, forgotten by time. But the projector, the ancient, dust-covered machine, was running. I could see the faint shadows of moving images on the screen, but there was no one in sight. The figures from before, those silent, shadowy watchers, they weren't there anymore. But I could feel something. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. The hum of the projector grew louder, almost deafening, like it was reaching out to me. I took a few hesitant steps forward, my eyes fixed on the screen. The images on the screen shifted rapidly, scenes from decades ago flashing in front of me, old black and white movies, scenes of people laughing, talking, living their lives. But there was something off about it. The faces were blurry, indistinct, their features warped. And yet, as they moved across the screen, they felt alive. Then I saw it, the figure in the back row, just as before. Only now, it wasn't a silhouette. It was clearer, more defined. A man in a tattered suit, his eyes wide open, staring directly at me. He wasn't just a figment of the past. He was there, and he was watching me. I froze. His gaze was piercing, and I couldn't tear my eyes away. The room seemed to grow colder, the air thicker, until it was hard to breathe. I stepped back, but my feet felt heavy, as if something was holding me in place. And then, as if in answer to my fear, the figure in the back row stood up. But it wasn't moving like a person. It floated toward the screen, its limbs contorted, stretching unnaturally, like it was part of the film itself. The hum of the projector rose to a crescendo. The figure reached the screen and seemed to melt into it, disappearing into the static. I stumbled back, my breath coming in shallow gasps. This wasn't just a movie. This was something else. Something alive, and it wanted me to be part of it. I turned to run, but the door was gone. The way I had vanished, replaced by an endless wall of darkness. I was trapped in the theater, and the only thing I could hear now was the unholy hum of the projector, louder and louder still, as I felt myself being pulled toward it. The darkness swallowed me whole. My heart raced, and every breath I took seemed to echo in the suffocating air. The projector's hum was no longer a distant sound, it was everywhere, vibrating through my bones, urging me forward. The screen flickered and pulsed like it had a life of its own, the shifting images now impossibly vivid, as if they were reaching out to touch me. I tried to turn back, but the world around me had changed. The theater I had entered moments ago, with its decaying seats and abandoned charm, was no longer familiar. The rows of chairs had dissolved into a vast, empty void, stretching beyond the reach of my flashlight's beam. It felt like I was standing in the middle of a dream, where nothing was quite real and everything was on the verge of slipping away. The figure, the man from the back row, was no longer just a shadow. His face had solidified, twisted into a grotesque mask of horror. His eyes were wide open, unblinking, staring straight through me. The air around me grew cold, and I could see my breath now, visible in the dim, flickering light. No, this isn't real, I thought desperately. But my feet wouldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, as if the darkness itself had a hold on me. The hum of the projector intensified. It was no longer a machine running, it was alive. The light from the screen pulsed like a heartbeat, and I could feel it, pulling me in. The figures in the film moved faster now, their faces no longer blurred. The people on the screen were no longer just watching me, they were beckoning to me. Their eyes, wide and pleading, their mouths moving soundlessly, as if urging me to come closer. I couldn't breathe. My lungs burned as I struggled to move, to escape, but my body refused to obey. The walls seemed to close in, the shadows stretching toward me. The figure in the back row moved again, but this time it didn't float toward the screen. It turned and began walking down the aisle toward me. Its body jerked unnaturally with each step, like it was fighting against some invisible force. Each movement was a grotesque imitation of life. I could hear the sound of its footsteps now, slow and deliberate, like the creak of an old door opening. It was getting closer, and with every step, the projector's hum grew louder, more demanding, until I thought my head might explode from the noise. This isn't real. It can't be. This is just some trick, I told myself, but the panic in my chest told a different story. I could see the man's face now, twisted, his features half-formed, a patchwork of forgotten memories. His eyes never left mine, and I could feel his gaze boring into my soul. I wanted to scream, to run, to tear myself from this nightmare. But my body wouldn't move. The figure reached the first row, then the second, and then it stopped, standing just a few feet from me. The room felt smaller now, the walls pressing in, suffocating me with the weight of its presence. Please, I begged silently, just let me go. The figure smiled. It wasn't a real smile. It was stretched, unnatural, a grin that didn't belong in a human world. Its lips curled back, revealing rows of jagged, rotting teeth. The sound of the projector reached a deafening pitch. It was no longer a machine. It was the air itself, alive and pulsing, resonating in my very bones. And then, to my horror, the figure stepped forward, its hands reaching toward me. They were cold, unnaturally so, and as they touched my arm, I felt a jolt of icy pain shoot through me. I gasped, my legs buckling beneath me. The figure's grip tightened, pulling me toward the screen. No, no, no! I reached out desperately, trying to grab onto anything, the chairs, the walls, anything. But my fingers slipped through the darkness like it was made of liquid. The figure's hand tightened around my wrist, dragging me closer to the screen. The light from the projector grew unbearable, blinding. I could see the images on the screen now, clearer than ever. The people in the film, those strange, ghostly figures, were reaching out to me, their eyes pleading, their mouths opening and closing soundlessly. They wanted me to join them. My body lurched forward. The figure's grip didn't loosen. It was pulling me into the light, into the screen itself. The fabric of the world seemed to tear around me, the edges of reality fraying. I could feel the coldness of the screen swallowing me whole. This is it. This is the end, I thought, as the world around me dissolved into static. But just as I thought I would be lost forever, something unexpected happened. The screen flickered, then went black. The projector's hum stopped. The cold fingers of the figure loosened, and I stumbled backward, collapsing to the floor. The room around me was silent. The darkness was suffocating, but it wasn't the same as before. It was empty. I was alone. The projector had stopped. The strange hum that had haunted the air was gone. I stood up, my legs weak, my heart racing. My eyes were still adjusting to the darkness, but I could feel it, something had changed. The air wasn't thick with fear anymore. It was still, hollow. I had escaped. But I wasn't free. I turned, eyes scanning the room, and that's when I saw it, the door. It was back. The way out. The same door I had seen before. But this time, it was open. Without a second thought, I ran. My feet carried me faster than I thought possible, desperate to escape the nightmare. The theater stretched out behind me, an endless abyss, but the door, the light, was all I could see. I didn't look back as I burst through the door, out into the night air. The cool breeze hit my face, but it felt empty, like I had left part of myself behind. And then, as I ran down the street, I heard it. A whisper, faint but unmistakable. "You can never leave." The words crawled through my mind, and I knew the cinema wasn't done with me. It would never be. The next few days felt like a haze. I tried to return to normal, to bury the memory of the cinema deep in my mind. But it kept clawing its way back. The whisper, "You can never leave," echoed in my thoughts, in every moment of silence. I couldn't escape it. I couldn't ignore the fact that the cinema still had its grip on me. The strange pull I had felt while I was inside still lingered, like a phantom weight pressing on my chest. I didn't want to go back. I didn't want to even think about that place. But no matter how hard I tried to shake it off, the nagging feeling never left. The town was small, and everyone seemed to know everyone else. I'd heard rumors that the cinema was haunted, that it had been closed down after a fire years ago. No one knew exactly what happened, but there were stories, tales of people going inside, never coming back. I had heard them all before, of course, but they were always just stories. Ghost stories. Tales spun for a late-night scare. But now, I knew better. The whispers had started again. Only this time, they weren't in my head. They were outside, in the wind, in the creaking of the old buildings around me. I could hear the projectors hum at night, faint but undeniable. It wasn't just a memory. It was real. One evening, I stood in front of the cinema once more. The building seemed different now. It didn't just feel abandoned. It felt alive, as if it were watching me, waiting for something. My feet had carried me here against my will. I had tried to stay away, but something was pulling me back. I couldn't resist any longer. I stood there, frozen, staring at the darkened windows, the faint outline of the projector light flickering inside. It was too much. I couldn't stay away. I walked toward the back door once. Again, the same door I had found the first time. This time, however, it was ajar, as if waiting for me. My hands shook as I pushed it open, the creaking of the hinges too loud in the stillness. The air inside was thick and stale, the smell of old leather and rotting wood overwhelming. But something else was there, too. Something metallic, sharp. A sense of dread. The hum of the projector was stronger now, more insistent. The air seemed to vibrate with it, filling the space around me, drawing me toward the screen. I didn't want to go further. I didn't want to step into that world again. But I couldn't stop myself. I stepped into the theater, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The rows of seats were empty, but it felt as if something was there, watching me, just out of sight. The shadows twisted unnaturally, moving like living things. Then, the screen flickered. And once again, I saw the figures. The people from before, those figures, now clearer than ever. But they weren't just images. They were reaching out to me, their eyes pleading. They were alive. Or at least, they felt alive. And in that moment, I realized something that terrified me more than anything else. The projector wasn't just showing old films. It was pulling people in. The figures weren't ghosts, they weren't just shadows on a screen, they were trapped inside. Like I had been. The man from the back row, the one who had smiled at me, appeared once again. His face was even more grotesque now, a half-formed, decayed mask that twisted in silent agony. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. His eyes were filled with a desperate, silent scream. My mind screamed at me to run, but I couldn't move. It was as if the screen had a hold of me, like I was tethered to it. The hum of the projector grew louder, filling my head, drowning out my thoughts. The man on the screen stretched toward me, his fingers reaching out, his face contorted with hunger. And then I realized the figures weren't just watching the film. They were waiting for me to join them. I stumbled back, but the walls of the theater closed in on me. The light from the projector flickered wildly, and I could feel the weight of their eyes on me, pressing down on me. The figure on the screen, the man, stepped out of the film, moving toward me. His steps were jerky, like a broken doll, his limbs moving in unnatural angles. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. My body was frozen, unable to move, caught in the web of the screen's power. And then I understood. The cinema wasn't just haunted. It was a trap. A prison. A place where the past and present bled together. Where the stories that were shown on the screen were more than just images, they were real. And once you stepped inside, once you were caught by the hum of the projector, you could never leave. I tried to run, but my legs wouldn't move. The man reached out, his cold hand brushing my cheek. His touch burned like ice. I felt my skin crawl, my body racked with the coldness of his touch. I screamed, but it was drowned out by the roar of the projector's hum. And then I realized I was already part of it. I was no longer just a person who had stumbled into a haunted theater. I was one of them now. One of the figures on the screen. One of the watchers, trapped in a world of light and shadow. The screen flickered once more, and the last thing I saw before the darkness took me was the figure, my own face, staring back at me from the screen, trapped in that endless loop, just like the others. And as the light from the projector faded to black, I understood that I would never escape. Time lost all meaning. The concept of days and nights blurred into a haze, and I could no longer tell where the world outside the cinema ended and where the film began. I had become part of the screen, but not as a spectator. No, I wasn't just watching anymore. I was trapped within the frames, existing as a shadow among the others, an unwilling actor in a film that never ended. The figures on the screen, myself included now, moved in a haunting, wordless dance. We were not alive, yet we weren't fully dead either. We simply existed in the liminal space between the two. Frozen, yet aware of our surroundings. The theater was no longer just a place, it was an endless loop, a pocket of time where no one could ever escape. I tried to scream, to break free, but my voice was nothing more than static. My thoughts were tangled, my own sense of self slipping away with every passing second. I could still feel my body, I think, but it was no longer mine. It was a part of the film, of the projector's unyielding grip. I was fading, vanishing into the light, into the story, becoming one of the ghostly figures forever replaying the past. And then, as the images shifted on the screen, I saw something, someone different. A figure. Alive. It was a man, standing in front of the screen, staring at us. His face was expressionless, his eyes wide with fear. His hand reached for the screen, as if he, too, were trying to touch the impossibility before him. The projector hummed louder, and the light intensified, a blinding light that hurt my eyes, making everything around me twist and bend. I tried to move toward him, to warn him, but it was no use. My body was no longer mine to control. I could only watch, helpless, as the man stepped forward, his fingers brushing against the glass-like surface of the screen. He was real, so real compared to the rest of us. And then the light around him began to change. The shadows warped, and the air grew thick with the sound of old film, the clicking of frames, the mechanical groan of the projector. It was like the cinema itself was alive, stretching, reaching into the past. The figures, us, moved faster, their faces now contorted with an expression of raw, wordless terror. The man looked at me, or rather, looked through me, his gaze passing over me as if I were nothing more than a forgotten memory, a fading dream. He turned to the others, his face filled with confusion, and for a brief moment, I saw it. He realized the truth. His hand reached up to his neck, as though he felt the invisible ropes tightening around him. He wasn't just staring at a film. He was seeing the reality of the cinema, the trap that had consumed so many before him. The figures on the screen were no longer part of some fictional world. They were real. We were real. And in that split second, the horror of it hit him. He understood that he wasn't just watching. He was about to become part of it. Part of the endless loop. His expression shifted, a scream forming on his lips. But it never left his mouth. The projector's hum grew deafening, drowning out everything else. The light from the screen expanded, pulling him in. His body began to flicker, to dissolve into the film, his limbs twisting unnaturally, becoming part of the reel itself. I could feel it. The shift. The change. The sensation of my own body starting to fade again, becoming lighter, more transparent. The edges of my vision blurred, as if I were melting into the light itself. And then, the screen went black. For a long moment, everything was silent. The hum of the projector stopped. The air felt thick, heavy, as though something had shifted, something had broken. And then the screen flickered back to life. But this time, it wasn't just a film. It was a new scene, a new group of figures, standing in the same theater. I could see them now, clearly. The man was there. His face was no longer one of terror. It was blank, empty. He was just another figure on the screen, a part of the endless, looping cycle. I realized with a sickening chill that I had become him. I had joined the others in the never-ending film. I was no longer a person, a memory. I was a part of the real, an image frozen in time, bound to replay for eternity. And then I heard it. The whisper that I had hoped would never return. You can never leave. I tried to scream, but there was no sound. There was only the flickering light, the mechanical hum of the projector, and the faces around me. The figures, all of us, locked in place, forever doomed to watch and never escape. The doors of the cinema were locked, but the walls were no longer solid. The light from the screen stretched into the dark corners of my mind, and I could feel it, the endless pull of the projector, dragging me further into the past, deeper into the film. I would never leave. I had become a part of it. And as the scene on the screen continued to unfold, I knew one thing for certain. This was my reality now. The cinema, the figures, the light, they were all I would ever know. And I would be watching, always watching, as the cycle began again. The mysterious bridge in Pennsylvania. I had never been one to believe in ghost stories. To me, they were just that, stories. People often claim to hear strange sounds or see figures in the dark, but I chalked it all up to overactive imaginations or the creepiness of old places. But that night, as I stood at the edge of that old bridge in Pennsylvania, I began to wonder if I was wrong. I had been traveling for a few days, hoping to clear my head. A quiet, peaceful escape from my chaotic life. A few friends had recommended visiting this old bridge, an isolated spot with a haunting reputation. It wasn't just the bridge itself that was rumored to be eerie, but the stories that surrounded it. The locals said it was haunted by the spirit of a woman dressed in white who had died there long ago. But no one really knew the details. I wasn't sure what I expected, maybe just a quiet, scenic view or place to snap a few photos. But as I approached the bridge, a strange chill settled over me. The air felt unusually cold, almost unnaturally so. The bridge stretched across a dark, slow-moving river, and the shadows of the trees around it seemed to press closer, as if they were watching me. It was a little unsettling, but nothing I couldn't handle. I dismissed the feeling, telling myself it was just the late hour. I walked closer to the bridge's parapet, trying to take in the view. The moon was hidden behind thick clouds, and only the faintest light illuminated the scene. But then, I heard something. A soft sound, barely audible at first, like a distant sigh carried by the wind. It was a woman's voice. I froze. At first, I thought it was just my imagination. But as I stood there, straining my ears, the sound grew louder, closer. It was unmistakable now, a woman crying, sobbing in deep, mournful sorrow. The noise echoed across the bridge, bouncing off the stone and trees, making it feel like the very air around me was thick with grief. I scanned the bridge, my heart pounding in my chest. There was no one in sight. The bridge was empty, the faint moonlight casting long shadows on the old wooden planks. I had to find the source. My curiosity got the better of me, and I moved closer to the parapet. The cry continued, growing louder with every step I took. It was a gut-wrenching sound, filled with pain, as though it was coming from someone lost and hopeless. Then, I saw her. She stood by the parapet, facing away from me, her long white dress flowing in the breeze. Her hair was long and dark, and her figure seemed almost ethereal. She was too still, too quiet in the way she cried. She didn't seem like a person at all. I took a step forward, trying to get a better look, but something stopped me. The moment my foot touched the bridge's stone, a wave of emotion hit me like a sudden gust of wind. It wasn't just sadness. It was overwhelming, deep sorrow, the kind that gripped you from the inside and made your chest ache. My throat tightened, and I felt my heart race. The pain that emanated from her seemed to seep into me, wrapping around me like a cold blanket, pressing on my ribs. My first instinct was to turn away, but I couldn't. Something was pulling me closer. I took another step, my breath shallow now, my thoughts growing foggy. The cry became more distinct, and with each sob, I felt myself slipping deeper into a sadness I couldn't explain. It felt like I was becoming part of her grief. But just as I reached the halfway point of the bridge, the woman turned. Her face was pale, her features hollow and drained. Her eyes were wide with a look of desperation, but there was something wrong with them, empty, almost hollow, like black pits staring into nothing. I froze, my body rooted to the spot. I wanted to scream, but no sound escaped. Her lips parted, but the cry was gone. Instead, there was a sharp, sudden silence. A cold wind swept through the air, pushing me back, and just as I thought I might fall, the woman's figure disappeared, vanished into the night, leaving behind only the echo of her sorrowful wail, drifting away into the darkness. I stood there, unable to move. The air had returned to normal, but the weight of her presence lingered. The cry still hung in the air, though I could no longer hear it. A deep, gnawing fear had settled into my chest. I glanced around, my pulse racing, but the bridge was empty once again. What had just happened? I felt the cold, damp grip of fear clutch at my spine. It was as if the very essence of her sadness had become part of me, seeping into my bones. It was a sadness that didn't belong to me, but somehow it felt too familiar. I wanted to leave, to run as fast as I could. But I couldn't tear myself away. Not yet. The eerie silence around me was now punctuated by my heavy breathing, my feet frozen to the bridge, unwilling to go forward, afraid to look back. And as the echo of her crying faded completely, the bridge once again seemed like just an old structure. But it wasn't. I knew that now. I knew it was a place of mourning, a place where grief didn't fade. It lingered. I needed to leave, but something told me the woman's cry had followed me. And I couldn't escape it. It would follow me wherever I went. I turned and made my way back, feeling her presence behind me, though I dared not look. The sound of the wind had changed, sharper, almost like a whisper in my ear. Her sorrow was now a part of me, and I couldn't forget the emptiness in her eyes. I didn't speak to anyone that night. I couldn't. The weight of what I'd experienced on the bridge had pressed into me, and I wasn't sure how to explain it, even if I wanted to. I had walked back to my car in a daze, my hands shaking, my thoughts clouded by the echo of that woman's cry. I told myself it was just a trick of the wind, a local legend that had played on my mind. But I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't. The next morning, I tried to act as if nothing had happened. I told myself it was just a strange experience, nothing more than an eerie coincidence. I walked around the small town, trying to get my mind off the events of the previous night. The streets were quiet, and the sun was bright, the kind of peaceful morning that made me feel foolish for letting my imagination get the best of me. But no matter how hard I tried to push the thoughts away, I couldn't ignore the lingering sense of unease that clung to me. It was like a dark cloud following me wherever I went. The weight of that woman's sorrow felt like it was wrapped around my chest, tightening with every passing moment. Her cry had left a mark on me, a stain that couldn't be washed away. I found myself looking over my shoulder constantly, half expecting to see her, standing by the bridge again, waiting. By the time I returned to the bridge that evening, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the water. The bridge looked even more eerie in the fading light, the once peaceful scene now tinged with something darker. The wind was calm, but the air was thick, almost suffocating. As I walked towards the bridge, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I stood at the edge, staring at the water below, the same sense of dread from last night creeping over me again. But this time, I wasn't alone. I heard the faintest whisper of a sob, so soft at first that I thought I might have imagined it. But then it came again, louder this time, rising from the darkness. My heart skipped a beat. It was her. I could feel it in my bones. The woman in white. I turned slowly, my eyes scanning the bridge. And there she was, standing by the parapet, her back to me, her white dress billowing in the wind. Her figure was faint, but there was no mistaking it. She was real. And she was waiting. Her sobs grew louder as I took a cautious step forward. My breath hitched, and the same overwhelming sadness from the night before washed over me, threatening to drown me in its depth. The feeling was suffocating. It wasn't just the cry, it was the sorrow, the sense of loss, the endless grief that seemed to pour from her very being. I wanted to run. I wanted to turn around and leave, but something inside me, something deep and inexplicable, drove me closer. I reached out a trembling hand, my mind screaming at me to stop. But my feet moved of their own accord. I couldn't control my body, couldn't stop the pull that came from her sorrow. As I drew nearer, I saw her turn, her face still hidden beneath her dark hair, her tears streaming down her pale cheeks. And then, she looked up at me. Her eyes were black. Not just dark, but black as coal, empty and lifeless. And in that moment, I felt it. A wave of grief, far deeper than I could comprehend, washed over me, flooding my senses, choking me. It was as though her sorrow had become my own, filling me with the same hopelessness, the same endless longing that had driven her to this bridge. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. I could only feel her despair, heavy and suffocating, pulling me under. I reached out, as if I could somehow save her, but as my hand neared her, she began to dissolve, her form blurring like smoke, leaving only the echo of her weeping behind. And then, just like the night before, she was gone. But her presence lingered. The air felt thick with sadness, and the echo of her crying seemed to stretch out from the bridge, growing louder with each passing moment. It felt as if the sound was coming from everywhere, from the trees, the water, even from inside my own mind. I staggered back, my heart pounding in my chest, my hands shaking uncontrollably. I tried to scream, but no words came out. It was as though the very act of speaking had been stolen from me. All I could do was stand there, paralyzed by the weight of her sorrow, a sorrow that had now become mine. I stumbled away from the bridge, not looking back, but the sound of her crying followed me, haunting me. It was no longer just a distant echo, it was inside me, part of me now. Her grief had become my own, her pain my pain. I don't know how long I walked. I don't know how far I went. All I knew was that I couldn't escape it. The cry, the grief, the woman in white, they were inside my head now, and they would never leave. I can still hear her. Even now, as I write this, I can hear her faint sobs, like a distant whisper, tugging at the edges of my mind. I know she's still out there, waiting for the next person to approach, to feel the weight of her sorrow. And I wonder, what happens to the ones who get too close? The ones who can't turn away, who can't escape the pull of her grief. I wonder if I'm already lost. I didn't sleep that night. How could I? Every time I closed my eyes, her face flashed before me, those empty, hollow eyes, the overwhelming sorrow pouring from her. The silence in my room felt heavy, like the weight of her grief was pressing down on me. I could hear the distant echo of her cries in my mind, and no matter how tightly I shut my eyes or how loud I tried to shout, I couldn't block it out. The next morning, I woke up, exhausted, my mind still spinning. I thought I was going mad. There had to be a logical explanation for everything, the strange sensations, the intense sadness, the apparition. But deep down, I knew I wasn't just imagining it. Something real was haunting that bridge. And it had followed me. I decided to leave. The town, the bridge, the memories, everything. I couldn't bear the thought of staying any longer. I packed my bags and tried to shake off the feeling of her presence lingering around me. But every moment felt suffocating. I walked around the small town, my steps heavy, but the more I tried to avoid thinking about her, the more she seemed to creep back into my thoughts. That afternoon, I decided to go back to the bridge one last time. Something inside me pushed me towards it. I knew it was dangerous, but I needed to understand. I needed closure. When I arrived, the place seemed quieter than I remembered. The wind was still, the air colder. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the bridge and the river below. I hesitated, standing at the edge of the bridge, unsure of what to do next. And then, I heard it again, the soft sobbing. It was faint at first, like the whisper of a memory, but then it grew louder, closer. My heart began to race, and I felt that familiar weight pressing down on me. The sadness, the sorrow, it enveloped me, tightening around my chest. I looked towards the parapet, and there she was, standing in the same spot, the same white dress fluttering in the wind. Her long, dark hair hung loose, and her face was turned away from me, as if she didn't know I was there. For a moment, I stood still, trying to convince myself that I could turn away, that I could leave without confronting her again. But then, I took a step forward. The pull was too strong. I reached the parapet, my feet moving of their own accord. The closer I got, the stronger the sadness became, like an invisible force gripping my heart. It was impossible to ignore. Her cry filled my ears, echoing in the stillness, until it felt like the only sound left in the world. I stopped just a few feet away from her. My breath was shallow, my chest tight with the weight of what I was feeling. And then, slowly, she turned toward me. Her face was the same, pale, hollow, eyes dark and empty. But this time, there was something different. This time, she looked at me, really looked at me, and I felt her pain, all of it. The grief, the hopelessness, the agony. It rushed into me like a floodgate opening, and I staggered back. "Why are you here?" I heard myself whisper. The words came out of nowhere, as if I was no longer in control. "What do you want from me?" The woman didn't respond. She just stood there, staring at me with those empty eyes, her sobs growing louder. But this time, I felt something else, something darker. Her figure began to blur, fading like smoke, until all that remained was a whispering sound, the cry reverberating in my mind. But it wasn't just a cry anymore. It was a plea. "Help me," the voice whispered, but it wasn't the woman's voice. It was something deeper, more guttural, something old and full of pain. I backed away, my body shaking, my mind racing. The air felt suffocating. I needed to leave, but my feet wouldn't move. I couldn't escape it. And then, everything went silent. The woman was gone, but I could still feel her presence, as if she was watching me from the shadows, waiting. The echo of her cry was gone, but it had left something behind. Something real. Her sorrow was now embedded in me, and I could feel it in every breath I took. It was part of me, and I couldn't escape it. As I turned and walked away, the cry began again, faint at first, then growing louder, as if it was following me, lingering just behind me, never letting me forget what I had felt. The echo of her pain was always there, waiting to wrap itself around me again. And I knew, deep down, that I couldn't run. She would always be there, waiting by the bridge, waiting for the next person to come too close to feel the weight of her endless grief. And when they did, she would claim them, just like she had claimed me. I was no longer the same. The sadness had seeped into my bones, and I knew that no matter where I went, no matter how far I ran, I would never escape it. The woman in white would always be there, standing at the edge of the bridge, waiting. And now, so would I. Days turned into weeks, and yet, the feeling of that woman's grief never left me. It was like a constant hum in the back of my mind, a persistent ache that refused to subside. I thought I could outrun it. I tried. I moved to another town, away from the bridge, hoping that a change of scenery would somehow free me from the haunting presence that lingered within me. But it didn't work. No matter where I went, her cries followed me. I would hear them in the quiet moments when the world was still, soft sobs in the corners of my mind, whispers in the wind. At night, I would wake in a cold sweat, her face staring at me in the darkness. Her sorrow was with me, woven into my very soul. The sadness was overwhelming, suffocating. It wasn't just grief anymore. It was like an invisible weight that pressed down on my chest, making it hard to breathe, hard to think. I tried to push it away, tried to reason with myself, to tell myself that it was just a memory, a moment that had passed. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. I had become part of her endless cycle, and she would never let me go. It was early one morning, just before dawn, when I couldn't take it anymore. I found myself on the road again, heading back to the bridge. I didn't know why. I didn't want to go. But the pull, the same magnetic force that had drawn me to her the first time, was too strong. It was as if she was calling me, beckoning me back to where it all began. As I arrived at the bridge, the air was cold and still. The water below glistened in the pale light of the moon, and the bridge seemed to loom over me like some ancient, forgotten relic. I could feel her presence, even before I saw her. The weight of her sorrow was in the air, thick and heavy, pressing down on everything. I hesitated, my heart racing. But I couldn't stop myself. I stepped forward, my feet moving as though they had a mind of their own. The closer I got to the parapet, the stronger the pull became. I knew what was coming. I knew she was there, waiting for me. And then, I saw her. She stood in the same spot, her white dress billowing in the wind, her back to me. Her sobs were quiet at first, but they grew louder with every step I took toward her. She was always crying, always waiting, but I knew this time was different. This time, I wasn't afraid. I stopped a few feet away from her, my heart pounding in my chest. I had seen her once before, but now it felt different, more real, more tangible. I could feel the weight of her grief pressing into me, her sorrow consuming everything. It wasn't just her sadness anymore. It was mine. It had become part of me, and I couldn't escape it. I reached out a trembling hand, my fingers brushing the cold stone of the parapet. And then, she turned. Her face was the same, pale, hollow, with those empty eyes that seemed to pierce straight through me. But this time, she didn't look at me with the same detachment. She looked at me with something else, something darker. Her eyes were filled with recognition. She knew me now. She knew I had come back, and she knew why. I opened my mouth to speak, but no words came out. I wanted to ask her why. Why was she here? Why was she trapped in this endless loop of grief? But I couldn't find the words. Instead, the sound of her sobbing grew louder, more desperate. The grief poured out of her like a river breaking its banks, and I felt it surge into me, flooding my mind, my heart. I could feel her pain, her loss, as if it were my own. I could feel the weight of a love lost, a soul broken by something beyond understanding. And then, as I stood there, it happened. She reached out to me. Her cold, ghostly hand touched mine, and I was pulled into her world. The bridge, the river, the town, they all faded away. I was no longer on solid ground. I was in the endless void of her sorrow, surrounded by darkness, and all I could hear was her cry, louder than ever before. For a moment, I thought I was drowning in her grief. It was too much. I wanted to scream, to run, but there was no escape. There was only her pain, and the endless pull of the cycle. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, everything went still. I was standing at the edge of the bridge again, the wind soft against my skin, the moonlight casting long shadows across the water. The woman in white was gone, but I could still hear her crying. It wasn't distant this time. It wasn't an echo. It was inside me. Her grief had taken root, planted itself deep within me, and now it would never leave. I could feel it in my bones, a deep, gnawing emptiness that would never be filled. Her sorrow had become mine, and I knew that I had become part of the cycle. Every person who came to the bridge would feel her grief, her endless sadness. And once they did, they would never leave either. They would become part of her pain, just like I had. And so the cycle continued. Forever. I left that bridge for the last time, but as I walked away, I could feel her eyes on me, watching, waiting. And I knew that wherever I went, whatever I did, I would never be free of her. She would always be with me, her sorrow, her grief, and her endless cries. I was now part of her story, and she, part of mine. Time passed, but the pain never faded. Every step I took felt as though it was weighed down by her sorrow. I tried to live, to move forward, but nothing felt real anymore. The world around me seemed distant, like a dream I couldn't wake up from. And the echoes of her cries? They never stopped. They followed me, like a shadow, always lingering just behind me, in the corners of my mind. At night, I would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, and all I could hear was that soft sobbing. It became a part of me, the constant reminder of the bridge, of her, of what I had become. And I realized something that filled me with dread. I had taken her place. The first time I saw her, I had thought she was trapped, cursed to wait forever by the bridge. But now, I understood. She wasn't waiting for someone to help her. She was waiting for someone to take her place. And now that I had come too close, now that I had felt her grief, I was bound to her. The same endless sorrow would follow me, just as it had followed her. I tried to run again, hoping that maybe, if I went far enough, her presence would disappear. I moved to a different city, a different state, but it didn't matter. It didn't change anything. Her cries were still there, louder than ever, always whispering in the back of my mind. Every time I passed under a bridge, every time I saw water ripple in the moonlight, I felt it, her cold touch, her pain seeping into my skin. I tried to find ways to rid myself of it. I visited doctors, therapists, hoping they could help me. But how could anyone help when the curse wasn't in my body, it was in my soul? How could I explain the weight of another person's grief, the endless sorrow that gnawed at me from within? One day, I returned to that town, to that bridge. I couldn't stay away. It was as though the bridge itself had some kind of power over me, pulling me back every time I thought I could escape. When I arrived, the air felt heavy, thick with an unspoken sadness. It was late, the night sky clear and cold. The bridge was empty, just as it always was. But the moment I stepped onto it, I felt that same sorrow envelop me. Her cry was louder now, more insistent, and it sounded closer than ever. The weight on my chest grew, and I could feel my breath quicken. I had to stop this. I had to end it. But I knew deep down it wasn't possible. The cycle would continue. No matter how hard I tried, no matter how far I ran, I would never be free of her. She was a part of me now, and I was a part of her. As I stood at the edge of the bridge, the darkness around me seemed to deepen. The cold air wrapped itself around me like a suffocating blanket. I heard her sobbing again, but this time it wasn't a distant sound. It was right behind me, close enough that I could feel her pain like a sharp needle in my skin. I turned, expecting to see her standing there, her white dress fluttering in the wind, but she wasn't there. The bridge was empty. Yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that she was still there, watching me, waiting for me to make the next move. I took a step back. And then another. My heart pounded in my chest as I felt something shift in the air. The world around me seemed to blur, and the sound of her crying grew louder, almost deafening. It was as if the bridge was closing in on me, the space growing smaller, tighter. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. And then, in the blink of an eye, I felt her hand, cold, ghostly, press against my shoulder. I froze. I didn't turn around. I couldn't. But I felt her there, her presence surrounding me like an inescapable force. Her grief was no longer just an echo in my mind. It was real, it was alive, and it was now a part of me. I realized with horror that I had become her, or at least a version of her. Her sadness was mine. Her fate was mine. The cry was no longer just a sound. It was a voice in my head, a voice that I now shared. "Help me," the voice whispered, but this time it wasn't just a plea. It was a command. A curse. I wanted to scream, to run, but I couldn't. I was trapped. Trapped in the same never-ending grief that she had known. I had crossed a point of no return. And as I stood there, the world around me darkened, and I felt the pull of the bridge deepening. The air grew colder, the shadows longer, and I knew, in that moment, that I was no longer in control. The cycle had come full circle. I was now the one waiting. The one crying. The one who would stand at the edge of the bridge, forever lost in the pain of another soul, calling out to those who dared to come too close. I had become part of the bridge's curse, her curse. And when the next person came, drawn by the soft sobbing, they would take my place. They would become part of the sorrow. And so the endless cycle would continue. Forever. The Devil's Ravine in California. Have you ever felt like something was watching you? Not in the way we all joke about, but the kind of feeling that digs deep under your skin, takes root in your bones, and makes the hairs on the back of your neck stand up? I didn't believe in that kind of stuff until I visited the Devil's Ravine in California. I was a photographer at the time, looking for new places to capture in my lens. A friend of mine, an old local, had mentioned the ravine a few times. "You're better off staying clear of that place," he'd said, his voice dropping when he spoke of it. But curiosity won over caution. I decided to go there on my own, thinking it was all just a bunch of superstition. The sun was setting when I arrived. The golden light filtered through the trees, casting long shadows on the ravine's rocky edges. The air smelled of dry earth and pine, a typical California scent. But there was something about the place that felt off. The silence was thick, almost suffocating. It wasn't like the peace of nature I was used to. It was a hollow quiet, one that gnawed at you, made your thoughts louder than the world around you. I set up my camera, adjusting the lens to capture the craggy rocks and the deep cuts in the earth. The ravine stretched ahead of me, its walls steep and jagged, the shadows inside seeming to move even though the breeze was still. That's when I heard it, the whisper. At first, I thought it was just the wind playing tricks, maybe the rustling of leaves. But as I listened, the sound became clearer. It was too deliberate to be the wind. It was soft, almost like a murmur, just out of reach, coming from somewhere deeper in the ravine. I stood frozen, trying to pinpoint the source. "Hello?" I called out, my voice cutting through the stillness. No answer. Only the whisper grew louder, as if calling me. I turned to leave, my stomach tightening. Something about the place was pressing against me, urging me to turn back. But as I stepped toward the exit, my foot caught on a loose stone, and I stumbled forward. That's when I saw the shadow. It wasn't just a dark spot in the fading light. It was a figure, tall, slender, with a shape that seemed to distort the space around it. The shadow moved along the ravine wall, just out of sight, but I could feel its presence, like it was aware of me, watching. My pulse quickened, and I instinctively stepped backward. The whisper came again, louder this time, almost like it was right next to me. "Leave." I could feel the air shift, turning cold, as if the ravine itself was breathing, its walls closing in on me. My heart hammered in my chest as I instinctively turned to flee, but my legs felt like they were frozen, as if something was pulling me deeper into the ravine. I snapped the camera, capturing a shot of the shadow that now seemed to pulse with an unnatural darkness. But when I looked at the picture, there was nothing there. No figure. No shadow. Just the rocks and the fading light. Panic surged through me, and I began to run, not looking back, knowing that if I did, I wouldn't be able to escape whatever was lurking behind me. The whispers followed, urging me to leave, urging me to stop. But it wasn't just the whispers anymore. I could hear something else, footsteps, quick and soft, scraping along the rocky ground. I burst out of the ravine and didn't stop running until I reached my car, my chest heaving, my hands trembling. I slammed the door shut, locking it. The whispers had stopped, but the unease didn't leave me. It lingered, as if the ravine had branded me, marking me as one who had been touched by something beyond comprehension. I drove back to town with my mind racing. The shadows, the whispers, it didn't make sense. There had to be an explanation, right? But every time I tried to make sense of it, my thoughts got tangled, and the feeling of something watching me wouldn't go away. What was it? What was waiting for me in that ravine? I didn't know it yet, but I was already marked. The ravine had chosen me, and it would not let go so easily. The shadow in the ravine wasn't the only thing I'd have to face. The weeks after I visited the Devil's Ravine felt like they were shrouded in an eerie fog. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. My nights were restless, plagued by dreams of the ravine and that figure, its shape stretching across the walls of my mind like a twisted silhouette. The whispering voices would creep into my thoughts while I was awake, soft and insistent, always urging me to come back, to uncover what was hidden. I thought about returning to the ravine, confronting whatever had happened, but every time I even considered the idea, my body froze, as though it knew the danger that awaited. But I couldn't stop thinking about it. I had to know what was going on. I had to prove to myself that there was an explanation, anything to dismiss the creeping dread. A month after my first visit, I found myself back at the edge of the ravine. The air was thick with heat, and the sunlight was blinding, but there was no warmth in it. The place felt wrong. The same unease that had gripped me the first time was back, settling in my chest like a stone. I stood at the entrance for a long time, trying to convince myself that I was just being paranoid. It was just a ravine, a deep cut in the earth, nothing more. But then I heard it, the whisper. It was faint, but it was unmistakable. It came from deeper inside, where the shadows clung to the jagged walls. My body tensed, but I stepped forward anyway, as if some unseen force was drawing me in. The ravine had an oppressive silence, one that swallowed every footstep and every breath. My shoes scraped against the rocks as I walked, the sound far too loud in the stillness. Every now and then, the whisper would rise again, but this time it wasn't calling my name, it was laughing. Soft, high-pitched, and mocking. Suddenly, I stopped. A cold chill washed over me, making the hair on the back of my neck prickle. I wasn't alone. There was someone, or something else here with me. I turned, but saw nothing. Just the towering walls of the ravine, casting long shadows as the sun began to dip lower in the sky. Yet, in the corners of my eyes, I could sense movement. Figures, tall and slender, flitting along the edges of the rocks, too quick to focus on. And then, as I turned, I heard it again, the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind me, soft yet deliberate. My heart thudded in my chest. I forced myself to keep walking, my breath shallow. It's nothing, I told myself. It's just the wind, just the wind. But the more I told myself that, the more the whispers grew louder, their voices blending together into a cacophony of laughter, sorrow, and malice. Leave. Leave now. The sound of footsteps grew closer, and the air grew thick, choking me. I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see nothing but the empty ravine behind me. But there, at the edge of my vision, was a shadow, tall, dark, and shifting, its edges flickering like a flame caught in the wind. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. The figure stepped forward, its movement jerky, unnatural. It was a person, or at least had once been a person. It wore a tattered dress, its face obscured by a veil of darkness. I could feel its eyes on me, watching me with an intensity that made my stomach churn. Go back, it whispered. You don't belong here. I didn't wait to hear more. I turned and ran. My feet barely touched the ground as I sprinted through the ravine, desperate to escape. The whispers followed, echoing in my ears, louder and louder with every step. I could feel the air growing colder, and the shadows seemed to stretch, reaching for me, pulling me back. The ground beneath me shifted. I stumbled, tripping on a rock, and fell hard onto the dirt. Panic surged through me. I had to get out. But as I scrambled to my feet, I heard something that froze me in place, the sound of breathing, low, ragged, and far too close. I turned slowly, my eyes wide with fear. The shadow was there again, standing just beyond my reach, its outline clearer now. The figure didn't move, just stared at me, its presence heavy and oppressive. Then it spoke again, its voice like a hiss. You should have never returned. I stumbled backward, my mind racing. What was it? What did it want? And why couldn't I escape it? The world around me seemed to close in, the walls of the ravine narrowing as if they were alive, pressing in on me. I felt the weight of the darkness pressing against me, suffocating me. There was no escape. I turned and ran again, but this time, the footsteps behind me were too fast. They were almost on top of me, like they were moving with me, chasing me, closing in. The whisper turned into a scream, a voice so shrill it cut through my thoughts. I reached the edge of the ravine, my breath ragged, my heart pounding. But as I ran toward the open space beyond, I felt something grab me from behind, pulling me back into the darkness. The last thing I heard before everything went black was the voice, laughing, whispering, "You'll never leave." I woke up in a daze, my body cold and stiff as I struggled to orient myself. The familiar crunch of gravel underfoot, the biting wind against my skin, it was all wrong. I wasn't in the ravine anymore. My surroundings were unfamiliar, and the darkness around me felt deeper than it should have been. I tried to stand, but the world swayed beneath me, my head pounding as if someone had driven a nail into my skull. I forced my eyes open, and for a moment, I couldn't understand what I was seeing. It wasn't the open sky I had expected. The ground was uneven, scattered with rocks that glistened in the dim light, almost like they were alive, pulsing with a sickly glow. The air was thick with the same oppressive silence I had felt earlier, only now it was heavier, suffocating. And there, at the edge of my vision, the whispers were back, louder, clearer, more insistent. I tried to take a step forward, but my legs wouldn't move. A weight, invisible yet undeniable, pressed down on me, making every movement feel like I was wading through thick mud. The whispers twisted into incoherent mumbling, followed by a low, guttural growl that made my blood run cold. The ground beneath me shifted again, and I realized with a jolt that I wasn't alone. I turned slowly, dreading what I might find, but my eyes locked onto something that made my heart race in panic. At the far end of the twisted, cavernous space stood a figure, its shape vague and indistinct at first, but slowly, as if forming from the shadows themselves, it began to solidify. It was the woman in the tattered dress. But something was wrong. She wasn't the same as before. Her face was still hidden, but now the edges of her silhouette seemed to blur and ripple, like her very presence was a distortion in reality. Her movements were jerky, unnatural, as if she were more a thing of nightmare than a living being. "Why?" The voice came, not from her lips, but from all around me. The words echoed in my skull, filling my mind with a crushing pressure. "Why did you come back?" The air grew colder, the temperature dropping so fast that I could see my breath puffing in the thickening gloom. The shadows around the woman stretched unnaturally long, curling around the jagged rocks like snakes. Her presence was suffocating, and I felt the weight of the ravine, of its entire cursed history, pressing in on me. My legs buckled beneath me, and I collapsed to the ground, gasping for air. "You should have stayed away," the voice purred again, now much closer. The woman's form inched forward, her footsteps silent but ominous. "You cannot leave. No one ever leaves." I tried to stand, but my legs refused to support me, shaking uncontrollably. Fear rooted me to the ground as the dark figure drew nearer. The whispers were no longer just voices, they were hands, invisible and cold, tugging at the edges of my mind, pulling me deeper into the abyss. "Why? Why me?" I choked out, my voice barely a whisper, the words barely able to escape my throat. The woman stopped, her figure now mere feet away. Her face remained hidden, but I could feel her eyes on me, dark and endless. She tilted her head, her silhouette shifting in an almost mocking manner. "You are here because you listened," she said softly, her voice sending chills down my spine. "You are here because you came." The shadows around me seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting like a living, breathing thing. I couldn't escape. My chest tightened, my breathing shallow and desperate. The darkness seemed to close in on me, the walls of the ravine disappearing entirely, leaving nothing but a void, a vast emptiness where even the sound of my breath seemed to vanish. "I don't belong here. I don't want this. Let me go." I cried out, my voice shaking with terror. but the woman said nothing in return. Instead, the ground trembled beneath me, and a low, deep rumble filled the space. The air grew thick, thick as if the very fabric of reality was being twisted, bent, and reshaped. The whispering voices surged, growing louder until they were deafening, a chorus of laughter, screams, and desperate cries that reverberated in every inch of my skull. I tried to move, tried to escape, but my body betrayed me. The shadows, the cold, the oppressive pressure, they all held me in place, as if the ravine itself had claimed me. My mind raced, my pulse pounding in my ears. There had to be a way out, I thought. There had to be something I could do. And then, like a snapping twig in the night, the air cleared. For a moment, it felt as though everything had paused, like I was standing in the eye of a storm. The shadows lifted slightly, and the pressure seemed to abate. The figure was gone. But the woman's voice lingered in the air, a soft whisper carried on the wind. You should never have returned. You'll never leave. The weight of her words hung over me as I struggled to stand, my legs still weak. But the space around me, it was changing. The ravine seemed to be closing in, folding in on itself. My vision blurred as the shadows began to twist again, but this time, they were not just around me, they were inside me. And I realized too late, there was no escape from the Devil's Ravine. Not for me, and not for anyone who dared to listen. The shadows around me deepened. It was as if the ravine itself had become alive, its very walls closing in on me. The woman in the tattered dress stood motionless, her face turned slightly toward me, yet her eyes never met mine. Her sorrow, so tangible, seemed to seep into the very air, pressing down on my chest, suffocating me with a cold, damp heaviness. I tried to move, but my legs felt rooted to the ground, as if invisible hands were gripping my ankles, holding me in place. The whispers, faint at first, now filled my ears, low, unintelligible murmurs that grew louder with each passing second. I could no longer tell where they were coming from, only that they seemed to swirl around me, curling in and out of the rock faces surrounding the ravine. The woman's head turned slightly, her face still obscured by shadows. I could hear her sobs, soft and sorrowful, but they were not like any tears a living person would shed. There was an unnatural quality to them, an echo of despair that stretched beyond the realms of time. It was as though the sound of her crying had been woven into the very fabric of the ravine. I took a tentative step toward her, my heart pounding in my chest. The moment I moved, the shadows shifted, seemingly reacting to my presence. The air grew colder, the oppressive weight of the atmosphere tightening around me like a vice. The whispers became clearer, now full of urgency, like a chorus of voices warning me to turn back. But I couldn't. I couldn't stop myself from walking toward her. Please, I whispered, though my voice trembled in the silence. What is this place? What do you want from me? The woman's head tilted slightly, as though considering my words. She didn't answer. Instead, her sobs grew louder, the sound of them vibrating through the ground beneath my feet. The shadows at the edges of my vision began to twist and writhe, taking on shapes I could not fully comprehend. Figures emerged, faint and ethereal, but they were there, watching me from the dark corners of the ravine. The sense of being watched was overwhelming, and the feeling of being trapped intensified. The closer I got to the woman, the more her sorrow seemed to invade my mind. It was no longer just a sound, it was a feeling. A profound, aching emptiness that clawed at my insides, leaving me hollow. I couldn't breathe properly, the weight of her sadness pressing in on me, drying out all rational thought. My hand shook as I reached out, desperate to touch her, to understand her grief, to make it stop. But just as my fingers grazed the air in front of her, she vanished. The space where she had stood was empty. The ravine, once filled with her haunting presence, was now just a place, cold, silent, and abandoned. The shadows, however, did not leave. They remained, creeping along the walls, their forms shifting and flickering, like something alive, something aware of my every movement. The whispers grew louder once more, now swirling into a deafening crescendo. I spun around, desperate to find an escape, but it was too late. The ravine had swallowed me whole. The darkness closed in, and I felt the last threads of hope unravel as the world around me disappeared. I ran. My breath was ragged, each step feeling heavier than the last. The ground beneath my feet seemed to shift, the earth treacherous and uneven, as if the ravine itself was alive and playing tricks on me. The shadows continued to move, following me like silent predators, their presence almost tangible, their cold touch just out of reach. I dared not look back, but I could feel them always just behind me. The whispers had become a steady hum in my ears, a constant drone of voices that whispered words I couldn't understand but knew I was meant to hear. They urged me forward, pulling me deeper into the ravine, driving me towards some unknown, inevitable conclusion. My heart hammered in my chest, the fear rising with every step. I couldn't escape it. I couldn't escape them. I stumbled over a rock, catching myself just before I fell, and in that moment, I heard something else, a sound that broke through the ever-present whispers. A single, sharp cry echoed through the ravine. It was a scream, but not a human one. It was the sound of something ancient, something filled with rage and despair. It was a cry of endless torment. I froze, my body trembling. The air had changed again, thick with something malevolent. The shadows seemed to pulse with life, shifting and swirling, as though they were searching for something, searching for me. My heart pounded in my ears, and a sense of dread so deep washed over me that I couldn't move. I was caught in a web of fear, unable to escape, unable to even breathe properly. Then I saw it, an outline in the distance, barely visible in the dim light. The woman in the tattered dress. She was standing there, but this time she was not motionless. She was moving. Slowly, dragging her feet through the dirt, her form flickering in and out of existence like a dying flame. Her sobs were no longer soft. They were raw, guttural, and full of such agony that I felt it in my bones. Her presence was suffocating now. The weight of her sorrow, her despair, was unbearable. I wanted to scream, to beg for help, but I couldn't find my voice. The whispering grew louder again, and this time the words were clear. Leave. Leave now. Leave or stay forever. But I couldn't. I couldn't tear myself away from her, from the pull of her presence. Something inside me, some primal instinct, told me that to leave would mean to leave behind something, someone. I didn't know who or what that was, but the pull was too strong to resist. I took a step forward, then another, the ground beneath my feet shifting in a rhythm that matched the beat of my heart. As I approached her, I saw her face, finally, after all this time, her face. It was pale, hollow, and stretched with an eternal sadness. Her eyes met mine, and in that moment, I understood. The ravine, the shadows, the whispers, they were all a part of her. She was the ravine. Her soul was bound to it, tied to the earth by her torment and grief. And then, in an instant, I understood something far worse. She wasn't waiting for someone to save her. She was waiting for someone to join her. A cold realization gripped me as I heard her final, heart-wrenching wail. The ground beneath me seemed to give way, and in that moment, I was falling, not just through the earth, but into the very depths of her pain, her endless sorrow. I tried to scream, but no sound came. The shadows engulfed me, and the whispers ceased, leaving only the silence of the abyss. And then, nothing. Devil's Field in Minnesota. I had heard the stories, of course. Everyone in the town of Millbrook knew about the lights. The strange, flickering flames that appeared in the fields at night. People said they were ghostly, like will-o'-the-wisps, luring unsuspecting wanderers into the vast stretch of tall, whispering grass. The lights weren't natural, they were wrong, and everyone knew it. Yet, despite the warnings, curiosity got the best of me one cold autumn evening. I had moved to Millbrook just a few months ago, and most of my time had been spent adjusting to the solitude of rural life. The few neighbors I'd met were kind, but there was an eerie silence that seemed to fill the empty spaces. The silence, however, wasn't as frightening as the tales of the field just beyond the edge of town. No one ever ventured there after dark. They claimed the lights would draw you in until you were lost, walking endlessly without direction until your body could go no more. But I wasn't scared. I had to see it for myself. To understand if it was just superstition or something deeper, something darker. It was late when I decided to go. The moon hung high in the sky, casting long shadows over the landscape. I bundled up in my jacket, grabbed a flashlight, and stepped out into the cool evening air. The wind rustled through the trees, and the scent of damp earth filled my nose. As I approached the edge of the field, I saw it, the light. At first, it seemed small, almost like a firefly, flickering among the tall, dry grass. But as I took another step, it grew brighter, more defined. It moved, just a few feet ahead of me, like it was beckoning me forward. I stopped. My breath caught in my chest. It was strange, yes, but there was something oddly beautiful about it. Almost mesmerizing. I felt an irresistible pull, a need to follow, to understand what was making it glow so intensely in the darkness. I could hear my footsteps crunching the dry leaves beneath my boots, but the field itself was eerily quiet. The wind had died down, and all I could hear was the faint hum of the light ahead, like a whisper that was barely audible but somehow clear in the silence of the night. Just a trick of the mind, I told myself, forcing my feet to move. The light flickered again, and I quickened my pace. I was close now, just a few steps away, but when I reached the spot where it had been, there was nothing. The field stretched out endlessly before me, nothing but shadows and rustling grass. My heart pounded in my chest as I turned in every direction, searching for the light. But there was nothing. Confusion gripped me, and I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. The light had been real. I had seen it. I hadn't imagined it. So where had it gone? I turned back, deciding to retrace my steps and head home, but as I walked, I noticed something strange. The field looked different. The familiar landmarks I had passed on my way in trees, a lone rock, were no longer where I remembered them. The land felt unfamiliar, foreign. It was as if I was no longer in the place I had just been moments ago. I stopped again, scanning the surroundings, trying to recognize something, anything that would give me my bearings. But there was nothing. Just the flickering light far off in the distance, and the feeling that I was no longer alone. My heartbeat quickened, and a strange unease settled in my chest. I turned in a circle, trying to focus on the sounds around me, but all I could hear was the whisper of the grass swaying in the wind. The silence between those whispers felt oppressive, almost as though the land itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I stepped forward, trying to force myself to be calm. Maybe I was just disoriented. Maybe the field was larger than I remembered. But as I took another step, the ground beneath me seemed to shift, subtly at first, like I was walking on a patch of unstable earth. I paused, glancing down, but saw nothing out of the ordinary. The tall grass swayed gently around me, as though the wind was playing tricks with my mind. The light was still there, though, further off now, glowing faintly like a distant star. It beckoned again, urging me to come closer. I resisted the urge, feeling the creeping panic of uncertainty tightening around my chest. Why wasn't I getting anywhere? Why did the land seem to change each time I tried to leave? I turned again, seeking the path I had walked in on, but the world around me had become a labyrinth of shadows. The trees I had seen earlier were no longer where they should have been. The rocks that marked my way were gone. Only the endless sway of the tall grass stretched on, undisturbed by my presence. What's happening? I muttered to myself, my voice shaky. I squinted into the distance, where the light still hovered like a tiny flicker of hope, but now something about it felt wrong. It wasn't just the strange pull it had over me, or the way it seemed to move ahead whenever I got too close. There was something darker in its glow, something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I started walking again, this time with more determination. My flashlight flickered in my hand, casting weak shadows against the grass. I had to find my way out. It was impossible for me to be lost. This was a small town, and the field wasn't that big, right? But as I walked, the silence grew heavier. The wind had stopped completely now, leaving only the sound of my own breathing and the faint rustle of the grass beneath my feet. Each step felt like a step deeper into something unnatural, something that didn't belong in the world I knew. Then I heard it. A whisper. Soft, faint, but unmistakable. It seemed to come from all around me, echoing off the walls of the field, a voice too distant to understand, but close enough to make my skin crawl. I froze, straining to hear. The whisper came again, a little louder this time, like a murmured chant, or perhaps a voice calling my name. I spun around, but the darkness only stretched out before me. Who's there? I called out, my voice sounding too loud in the eerie quiet. But there was no answer. Only the whispering that seemed to grow in intensity. I clutched my flashlight tighter, my hands clammy, my legs feeling weak beneath me. The light ahead flickered again, brighter this time, and before I knew it, my feet were moving toward it once more, as though something inside me had given up resisting. The whispers followed, weaving through the wind, the voices growing louder, closer, and then, suddenly, silent. The light was just ahead now, and I could almost reach out and touch it. But when I was mere feet away, it vanished, as though it had never been there at all. The world around me shifted again, the grass no longer the same, the sky darkening further, and the air growing thick with an oppressive weight. Not again, I whispered to myself, my breath catching in my throat. I spun around, desperate to find my way out. But no matter which direction I walked, the landscape remained the same, endless, empty, and impossibly vast. The field had swallowed me whole. In the distance, the whispering resumed, and this time it wasn't a voice I recognized. It was something older, something ancient, something that echoed with the weight of the earth itself. And then I heard a sound that made my blood run cold, a low, guttural growl. I wasn't alone anymore. The growl echoed through the field, sending a cold wave of terror crashing over me. My body froze, heart hammering in my chest. I stood still, straining my ears, trying to make sense of what I was hearing. The growl was low and unsettling, like an animal with a hunger it couldn't satisfy. But there was no animal in sight. No sign of life at all, aside from the rustling of the grass and that faint whispering that still clung to the air around me. I took a hesitant step backward, my eyes scanning the darkened field for any sign of movement. The light had disappeared again, vanishing as quickly as it had appeared, leaving me in total darkness. The shadows around me seemed to twist and stretch unnaturally, shifting with a life of their own, creeping toward me from all sides. And then I saw them. Figures. Shadows that were too solid to be mere tricks of the light. They moved slowly, weaving through the tall grass, their shapes indistinct but undeniably human. There were no faces, just the silhouettes of people who didn't belong. They moved with an eerie, almost practiced grace, gliding silently through the darkness, their forms blending seamlessly with the night. I could feel them watching me, closing in. The whispering had turned into a chorus now, too many voices overlapping, rising and falling in an unsettling cadence. The air grew thicker, heavier, as if the very atmosphere was pressing down on me, suffocating me with a cold, suffocating weight. I wanted to scream, to run, but my legs felt like lead. The shadows were getting closer, their shapes becoming clearer with each passing second. I could hear their footsteps now, soft at first, but growing louder until it felt like the very earth was trembling beneath me. They were coming for me. Panic clawed at my chest, and I spun around, searching for any sign of escape. But the field seemed endless. No matter which way I turned, there was nothing but darkness and the flickering of shadows. The growl was louder now, closer, and the figures were almost upon me. I finally broke free from the paralysis, turning and running blindly into the night. My flashlight bounced wildly in my hand as I sprinted through the grass, heart racing in my throat, lungs burning. But no matter how fast I ran, no matter how much distance I tried to put between myself and the shadows, the growl seemed to follow me, closer and closer, until it felt like I was being chased by the very darkness itself. Suddenly, the ground beneath my feet shifted again, as if the earth itself had been rearranged. I stumbled, falling forward, hands scraping against the rough, uneven ground. My flashlight flew from my hand and tumbled away, leaving me in complete blackness. I scrambled to my feet, my breath coming in ragged gasps, and started running again, this time without any source of light. The whispers grew louder, almost deafening, and the growl now had an eerie, guttural quality that seemed to resonate deep within my chest. The shadows were closing in. I could feel their cold fingers brushing against my skin, the brush of fabric against the backs of my legs as they crept closer, pressing in from all sides. I turned to face them, my mind racing. What was this place? Why couldn't I escape? My senses were overloaded. Every step I took felt like it was dragging me deeper into the field, farther from safety. The light, the shadows, the whispers, it was all becoming one unending nightmare. Then, just as I thought I couldn't go any further, a flash of light appeared before me, bright and sudden. It cut through the darkness like a beacon, blinding me for a moment. I stopped dead in my tracks, heart leaping in my chest. The light was different this time. It wasn't distant and teasing. It was close. It was real. But as I moved toward it, something within me screamed not to. I stopped, just a few steps away, frozen in place by an overwhelming sense of dread. The light flickered again, just like before, only this time, it didn't vanish. I reached for it, driven by desperation, but as my fingers brushed the edge of the glow, I felt the air around me freeze. A pressure built up in my chest, and the light flared once more, revealing the figure standing in the center of it. A man. His face was hidden in shadow, but his presence was unmistakable. The same whispers that had been haunting me now seemed to swirl around him, echoing in a language I couldn't understand. His hands reached out toward me, not in an invitation, but in a gesture that felt more like a warning. I stood frozen, the weight of the shadows pressing against me, until I felt something cold and sharp against my skin. It was the edge of his fingers, barely grazing my arm, but it was enough. The fear surged through me, overwhelming my senses, and I couldn't move. Suddenly, the ground beneath my feet cracked open, splitting wide as the field seemed to shift. The sky above me darkened, and the growl became deafening, a cacophony of sound that made my teeth rattle. The last thing I saw before the world closed in was the man's face, a twisted, hollow thing, with empty eyes and a mouth that stretched unnaturally wide, forming a grin that sent waves of terror crashing through my soul. And then, the light went out. The silence hit me like a physical force. It was as if the world had stopped moving, frozen in place, and I was left alone in its grip. My heart was pounding, my breath shallow and quick, as I struggled to make sense of what had just happened. The man, his face, the darkness, everything was fading away, and yet it was as if the nightmare had only just begun. I tried to move, but my limbs were heavy, weighed down by an invisible force that kept me tethered to the ground. I could feel the cold seeping into my bones, making it harder to breathe. The air felt thick, suffocating, as if I was drowning in something that wasn't quite air, something that was more like despair itself. Where was I? What was happening to me? I forced myself to take a step forward, the ground beneath me feeling unstable, as though it was shifting with every movement. The field stretched out endlessly in every direction, the same tall, swaying grass that had been there before, except now, it seemed darker, almost alive, curling and twisting as though reaching out to trap me. The whispers started again. They were faint at first, like a distant murmur, but then they grew louder, surrounding me. It felt like they were inside my mind, clawing at my thoughts, pulling me in every direction at once. I couldn't tell where they were coming from. There were no people, no figures, just the voices. "Help," one of them whispered. It was soft, desperate. "Come closer." My body reacted before my mind could catch up. My feet carried me forward, moving of their own accord, deeper into the field. I tried to resist, but it was like the whispers had hooked into my very soul, dragging me closer to whatever lay hidden in the darkness. The light had vanished, but something else had taken its place, an oppressive darkness that was even more suffocating. I stumbled, my feet tangling in the tall grass as I fought to maintain my balance. The shadows moved around me, flickering at the edges of my vision, always just out of reach. They seemed to mock me, teasing me with their proximity, daring me to try to catch them. I couldn't take it anymore. The fear, the whispers, the crushing weight of the darkness. It was all too much. I screamed, the sound lost in the vast emptiness of the field, swallowed by the night around me. And then, through the haze of terror, something changed. A figure appeared in the distance. At first, I thought it was just another trick of the shadows, but this time it was different. It was solid, real, moving toward me. The figure was small, almost childlike, its form blurry but unmistakable. I started to run toward it, instinctively, hoping for a way out, hoping that this time I could escape. As I got closer, the figure became clearer, a child, no more than 10 years old, standing still in the middle of the field, staring at me with wide, unblinking eyes. "Please, don't follow me," the child whispered, his voice so soft that I barely heard it over the rush of blood in my ears. But it was too late. My feet carried me forward, against my will, drawn to the child by something deeper than logic. I reached out a hand, wanting to touch the child, to stop this madness. And then, the ground beneath me gave way. I fell, tumbling into a void that seemed to open up beneath me, swallowing me whole. The field, the whispers, the child, all of it disappeared in an instant, replaced by an overwhelming blackness that seemed to stretch on forever. I hit the ground hard, pain shooting through my body, but it didn't matter. I was no longer in the field. I was somewhere else, somewhere cold and empty, trapped in the dark with no way out. The child's voice echoed around me, distant but clear. You shouldn't have come. I didn't know where I was anymore. I couldn't see, couldn't move. The whispers were louder now, closer. I could hear them behind me, around me, their voices growing more frantic, more desperate. They were closing in, surrounding me. Please, help me, I whispered, my voice trembling. But there was no answer. The whispers kept coming, rising in a crescendo of terror until they drowned out everything else. And then, all at once, the voices stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. And then, from somewhere in the darkness, I heard a single word, one final, chilling word that seemed to come from the very ground beneath me. Lost. Everything went black. I awoke in total darkness. My body was stiff, my muscles aching from the fall, but there was no pain that could distract me from the overwhelming sense of dread that clung to me. I was disoriented, barely able to gather my bearings. The air was thick, almost suffocating, and the silence was deafening until it wasn't. A low, distant hum filled the space around me, as if the very earth itself was vibrating with an unnatural energy. My heart pounded, and I forced myself to sit up, my hands trembling as I reached out in search of anything familiar. My fingers grazed something soft, something damp. It felt like grass, but it was different this time, heavier, almost like it was alive. I gasped and pulled my hand back, heart racing. What was happening? Where was I? I stood shakily, my knees weak, and tried to push through the fog in my mind. The whispers had stopped, but something worse had taken their place, a feeling of being watched, a presence just out of reach. I strained my ears, listening for any sign of movement, but there was only the hum, the deep, resonating sound that seemed to come from all around me. It felt like the very ground beneath my feet was alive, aware of my every movement. Suddenly, a faint glow appeared on the horizon, flickering like a candle caught in the wind. My pulse quickened. The light. It had to be the way out, right? The same light that had led me deeper into the field, the one that had tricked me before. But I had to follow it. I had to escape. I took a step toward the glow, then another, each one heavier than the last, as if the darkness itself was resisting my every move. The light was growing brighter, but it felt wrong, too bright, too inviting, like it was pulling me in, beckoning me to come closer. But I hesitated. The memory of the child's voice, the warning I had heard, echoed in my mind. You shouldn't have come. Was it too late to turn back? Had I already crossed a line that couldn't be undone? I looked around, my mind racing for answers. But there were no answers here. Just darkness and the distant, unearthly hum. I couldn't stay here forever. With one final breath, I pushed forward, forcing my feet to move, driven by an instinct I couldn't explain. The light flickered again, and I could almost hear a voice, distant and faint, calling my name. But it wasn't a voice I recognized. "Come closer," it whispered, a soft, melodic tone that sent chills down my spine. My pace quickened. I had to reach the light. I had to find a way out. The closer I got, the more the field around me seemed to stretch, growing wider, more endless. It was as if the light was the only thing that existed in the world, and the rest of it was dissolving into nothingness. My legs were trembling now, my chest tight with panic. The shadows were closing in, whispering, reaching out, pulling me back. But I didn't stop. And then, just as I was about to reach the light, something changed. The hum grew louder, deafening, and the light itself flickered violently, as though it were about to explode. I shielded my eyes, but it didn't help. The light grew brighter still, blinding me. I tried to scream, but no sound escaped. My body froze, caught in the light's grasp. The whispers returned, now a cacophony of voices, all speaking at once, all telling me to stop, to turn back, but it was too late. The ground beneath me gave way once more, and I fell again, deeper than before. The fall felt endless, like I was being swallowed by the very darkness that had haunted me from the start. And in the moment before I lost consciousness, the last thing I heard was the same word that had haunted me since the beginning. Lost. When I awoke, the field was gone. There were no whispers, no lights, no child. Just an overwhelming silence. I stood in a void, nothing around me but darkness and the faintest trace of a light that was now impossibly distant. The ground felt solid beneath my feet, but I had no idea where I was or how to get back. I looked around, but there was nothing to see. I was alone. Completely and utterly alone. And the last thing I could hear, as if carried by the wind, was the voice I had heard so many times before, still calling to me, still pulling me deeper into the void. Lost. And I realized then that I would never find my way out. The Ghost Boat on Lake Ozark. It was supposed to be a peaceful getaway. Just a weekend at the lake, far away from the noise of city life. I had heard about Lake Ozark before, a beautiful, serene place in the heart of Missouri. A perfect spot to relax and unwind. But something felt off the moment we arrived. The sun had set, casting a warm golden hue over the water, and we were sitting on the dock, drinking beers and enjoying the stillness of the evening. The only sound was the soft lapping of the water against the wood. But as the darkness deepened, a strange fog began to roll in from the center of the lake. At first, it was just a thin mist, creeping across the water's surface. But soon it thickened, shrouding the lake in an eerie, suffocating cloud. The air turned cold, and a chill ran down my spine. "What's with the fog?" I asked, trying to make light of it. "I've never seen it come in this fast," my friend replied, his voice tinged with uncertainty. "Sometimes it just rolls in like this, but it's never this thick." The others on the dock began to mumble nervously, glancing at each other. Something about the fog felt unnatural, like it wasn't just a weather pattern but something more, something that shouldn't be here. It crept closer, enveloping the dock, until we could barely see beyond the edge of the pier. Then, through the haze, something appeared. A boat. It wasn't moving fast, but it seemed to glide out of the fog, like it had been there all along, waiting. I squinted, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The boat was old, the wood withered and dark, its hull just barely visible in the fog. But what caught my attention, what made my blood run cold, were the figures on board. At first, I thought they were just shadows, mere tricks of the light. But as the boat drifted closer, I saw them more clearly. 3 figures sitting perfectly still on the boat. They were motionless, not a single one of them moving or speaking. Just staring at us, their eyes hidden in the deep shadows of their faces. I couldn't see their expressions, but I could feel their gaze. It was as if they were watching us, waiting for something. My heart began to race, and a sense of dread settled over me. "Who are they?" I whispered, barely able to find my voice. "I don't know," my friend replied, his face pale. "There's no one else out here." The boat continued its slow, steady drift towards us, but something felt horribly wrong. There was no sound of paddles, no movement at all. The boat just glided, carried by some unseen force. The figures on board remained silent, their heads turned toward us. The air grew colder, the fog thicker, and the water around the boat seemed to swirl in unnatural patterns. "Let's go inside," I suggested, my voice shaking. This isn't right." But before anyone could respond, the boat seemed to stop, just a few yards from the dock. For a moment, it remained perfectly still, as if waiting for something. I wanted to look away, to turn back and pretend I hadn't seen it, but I couldn't. My eyes were drawn to those figures, those hollow, lifeless shapes that were now watching us with an intensity that made my skin crawl. Then, as if on cue, the boat began to slowly move backward, disappearing back into the fog. The figures remained, still watching us until the boat faded completely from sight. The fog swallowed it whole, and in an instant, it was as though it had never been there at all. The silence that followed was suffocating. No one spoke for what felt like an eternity. We just stood there, staring at the spot where the boat had been, waiting for something, anything. But nothing came. "What the hell was that?" my friend finally muttered, his voice trembling. "I don't know," I whispered, unable to take my eyes off the water. "But I don't think we're alone out here." The fog had started to lift, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. Something had followed us. And as the lake returned to its eerie stillness, the air still felt heavy, charged with an unknown presence, as though the very water itself was watching us. We couldn't see the boat anymore, but the fear lingered, creeping into every corner of the night. Something had been there, and I had no idea if it was gone for good. The night dragged on in an uncomfortable silence. We all tried to act normal, pretending that the strange boat and its silent occupants had never happened. But as the hours passed, the unease only grew. Every rustle of the trees, every shift of the wind, seemed to echo with the memory of what we had seen on the lake. We went inside the cabin eventually, but the air felt thick, heavy. The walls, which had seemed warm and inviting when we arrived, now felt suffocating. I couldn't shake the image of those figures on the boat, motionless, staring. They were still in my mind, like shadows lurking just beyond my vision. "I think we should head out in the morning," my friend said, sitting by the window, his back to the rest of us. "This place, it doesn't feel right." I nodded, but I didn't feel any relief. If anything, the thought of leaving seemed worse than staying. There was something about the lake, something that felt like it was waiting for us to leave. I tried to explain it, but I couldn't find the words. It wasn't just a boat. It was everything. The stillness of the air, the way the fog moved like it had a mind of its own. "I think I'll just take a walk," I said, standing up abruptly. I needed to clear my head. Maybe a few minutes outside, away from the heavy atmosphere of the cabin, would help me shake off the unease. I grabbed my jacket and stepped back onto the porch, breathing in the cool night air. The moon was hidden behind the clouds, and the only light came from the stars, dim and distant. The fog had almost completely lifted, but the water still felt unnaturally still, like a mirror reflecting nothing. I walked down to the edge of the dock, peering into the water. It was quiet, unearthingly so. Then, I heard it. The faint sound of a boat, its hull scraping against the water. My heart skipped a beat. The boat was back. But it wasn't moving. I turned to head back to the cabin, but then I saw it, the same boat, drifting out of the fog, just like before. This time, it was closer. And this time, the figures on board weren't just sitting, they were standing. Tall, thin shapes with no clear features, just silhouettes against the moonless sky. I froze. My instinct screamed at me to run, but my legs wouldn't obey. I couldn't look away from the boat. The figures didn't move, but I could feel their presence, an overwhelming weight in the air. One of them raised a hand, slowly, as if beckoning me forward. I backed away, heart hammering in my chest. The fog was rolling in again, thicker this time, swallowing the boat, the figures, and everything around me. The next thing I knew, I was running. I don't know how long I ran for or how I even made it back to the cabin, but when I finally stumbled inside, I was breathless, drenched in sweat, and shaking. "They're out there," I gasped, collapsing onto the floor. "The boat, it's back." My friends looked at me, wide-eyed, but said nothing. I couldn't tell if they believed me or if they were just too scared to speak. I tried to calm myself, telling myself it had to be a trick of the mind, fog, shadows, nothing more. But deep down, I knew what I had seen. "Maybe we should leave now," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "This place is cursed, or haunted, or something." But when we looked outside again, the lake was empty. The fog had disappeared, and everything was calm. The boat was gone. For a moment, I almost convinced myself that I had imagined it. Maybe it was just the fear from the night before, playing tricks on my mind. But then, as I looked out the window, I saw it. A figure standing at the far end of the dock, watching the cabin. I couldn't breathe. I turned to my friends. "Do you see that?" They looked out the window, but there was nothing there. Just the empty dock. "What the hell, man?" one of them said, sounding both confused and worried. "There's no one out there." But I knew. I knew it had been there, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something otherworldly, was lurking in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike. I couldn't explain it. I didn't know what it wanted or why it was haunting the lake. But one thing was clear, we weren't alone on that water. And whatever it was, it wasn't finished with us yet. As the hours passed, I stayed awake, staring out the window, my mind racing. The fog, the boat, the figures, they would return. I didn't know when, but I knew they would. The lake had claimed its victims before, and it wasn't about to stop now. The question was, would we be next? I wasn't sure how much longer I could stay on the edge of that dock, waiting for the ghost boat to return, knowing that it would. But one thing was certain, I couldn't leave now. The lake was calling, and whatever it wanted, it wouldn't let us go that easily. The night stretched on endlessly. Every creak of the cabin, every gust of wind, felt like a warning. I sat by the window, staring at the now empty dock, trying to convince myself that I was just being paranoid. But the silence in the air felt thick, as if the world itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I tried to talk myself down. There had to be a logical explanation. Maybe it was just some weird natural phenomenon, reflections, shadows, some sort of optical illusion. But deep down, I knew what I had seen. And I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. One of my friends had fallen asleep in a chair. The others were huddled together, murmuring quietly, trying to make sense of the night's events. But the tension between us was palpable. We were all too afraid to speak openly about what we had seen, or rather, what we hadn't. What was out there? What did it want? And yet, despite the fear, the lake was eerily quiet. The only sound was the occasional rustling of the trees and the soft lapping of the water against the shore. It was as if the entire place had fallen into a deep, unnatural slumber, waiting for the inevitable. Then, just as I thought I could breathe again, the air shifted. The temperature dropped suddenly, and with it, the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. I looked outside, only to see the fog. It was coming in fast, rolling across the lake like a living thing, swallowing the world in its cold embrace. I heard at first the faint sound of a boat creaking as it sliced through the water. A chill ran through me, and my heart hammered in my chest. There was no mistaking it. The boat was back. I rushed to the door, flinging it open, my breath coming in sharp gasps as I scanned the horizon. The fog was thick now, almost impenetrable, but I could just make out the silhouette of the boat, gliding silently across the water. I saw them then, the figures, standing motionless on the boat, just as I had seen before. But now, there was something different about them. They weren't just figures in the fog anymore. No, they had shape now, substance. And the closer they came, the more I could see them. Their faces were pale, distorted, their eyes black and empty. The boat drifted closer, the sound of its wooden hull scraping the water growing louder, almost deafening. I felt an icy grip on my heart, and my body froze. I couldn't move. I couldn't tear my eyes away. One of the figures, tall and unnaturally thin, stepped forward. It raised a long, bony hand and pointed directly at me. The gesture was slow, deliberate. And then, in a voice that wasn't a voice at all, but a whisper that seemed to come from everywhere at once, I heard it. Tom. It wasn't a request. It wasn't even a command. It was a summons, a pull that resonated deep within me, like the water itself had called my name. The boat was close now, close enough that I could see the ripples of the water beneath it, the faded paint on the sides, the worn-out wood. And then, nothing. It vanished into the fog, as if it had never been there at all. Just like that. I blinked, trying to understand what I had just witnessed. My pulse raced, and my thoughts were a blur. It had been so real. I could still feel the pull of the boat, as though it had left something behind, a presence, an emptiness that lingered in the air. I stumbled back inside, my legs weak beneath me. My friends were awake now, staring at me with wide eyes. Did you see it? Did you see the boat? I asked, my voice trembling. They didn't answer immediately. They just looked at each other, their faces pale and tight with fear. Finally, one of them nodded. We saw it too. We all saw it. But it wasn't like before. This time, it felt different. I swallowed hard, my throat dry. What do you mean? I don't know, he said, shaking his head. It's like it was waiting for something. Or someone. The air in the cabin felt colder now, as if the fog had seeped inside, filling every corner, every crack. I could still feel it, like something was watching us. Something out there on the lake. We all stood there, silent, the fear wrapping around us like a thick blanket. No one moved. No one spoke. It felt like we were waiting for something, but no one knew what. Then, in the stillness, we heard it. A low, distant sound, like the faint creaking of wood. It was the boat again. But this time, it wasn't out on the lake. No, it was much closer. I turned slowly, my heart in my throat, and looked out the window. My blood ran cold. The boat was there, right in front of the cabin. And the figures were standing on the dock. They were watching us. The figures on the dock didn't move. They just stood there, staring at us with those empty, soulless eyes. I felt like I was suffocating, the air thick with dread, and my thoughts raced in every direction, trying to make sense of what was happening. But nothing made sense anymore. Not the boat, not the fog, not the figures who had come for us. Do you see them? I whispered, my voice barely audible. One of my friends nodded slowly, his face pale, lips trembling. Yes, I see them. But no one moved. None of us could. The fear was paralyzing, pressing down on us like a physical weight. I could hear my heart pounding in my chest, the sound deafening in the silence that enveloped the cabin. And yet, despite the terror gnawing at my insides, there was something else, something even worse creeping in, a deep, gnawing hunger. A desire to go to them, to answer their call, to step outside and join them on the boat. Don't, I whispered to myself, though it didn't feel like my own voice anymore. The thought was not my own, and it was all I could do to hold myself back. They're not real. It's just some twisted illusion. But my words felt hollow. The pull, that irresistible pull toward the dock, was getting stronger. I could feel it in my chest, tugging at my insides, wrapping itself around my heart, squeezing. The lake had claimed me. It wanted me. I glanced back at my friends, their faces drained of color, their eyes wide with the same fear I felt. We were trapped in the cabin, but we weren't alone. The figures were still there, unmoving, staring into the darkness of the window. Their presence was suffocating, like shadows stretching toward us, reaching for our souls. Don't go near them, one of my friends finally said, her voice shaking. Please. Don't leave. But I couldn't respond. I could barely hear her words over the rising whisper of the lake. Come. It was louder now, inside my head, and the words had become a command. A demand. I felt the door behind me open. How had it opened? I hadn't even heard the click of the handle, but it was standing wide, a gap of cold, black space that seemed to beckon me like a mouth of a cave. I knew what it meant. I knew it meant the boat. I knew it meant them. I backed away, fighting with every fiber of my being to resist, but my feet weren't listening anymore. They were moving, of their own accord, toward the door. Then, just as I reached the threshold, I heard a voice, real, clear, human, calling my name. Luke. I snapped back to reality, my heart jumping into my throat, and I spun around. It was my friend, Mark. He was standing in the center of the cabin, eyes wide, mouth moving as though he were trying to scream, but no sound came out. And then I saw it. Behind him, in the dim light, something was moving. A figure, just like the ones on the boat, but this one was closer. It was standing in the doorway behind him, its long, gaunt hand reaching out toward him. I tried to yell, to warn him, but my throat constricted, and my voice failed me. Mark didn't notice. He was too focused on me, too desperate to get my attention. Luke, don't go out there, he cried, his face contorted in fear. But it was too late. The figure behind him stepped forward, its cold, hollow eyes locking onto mine. It wasn't moving like a person anymore. It was a thing, something not quite human, not quite alive. And as it crossed the threshold of the cabin, I could feel the air grow heavier. The walls felt like they were closing in, as if the entire house was being consumed by the presence of whatever this was. Mark turned at the sound of the figure's movement, but when he saw it, his face drained of color. It was too late. The figure's long, bony fingers reached forward and grasped him, pulling him into the dark, swallowing him whole. I could hear his scream, but it was distant, muffled, like it was coming from underwater. Then, the silence returned. I stood there, frozen, my mind racing to process what had just happened. Mark was gone. Just like that. My legs gave out, and I collapsed to the floor, panting, gasping for air as if I'd been holding my breath for an eternity. I couldn't think. I couldn't breathe. It was only then that I realized the boat was still there. On the dock. The figures still standing, waiting. And I knew, without a shadow of a doubt, that they weren't waiting for Mark. They were waiting for me. My body was moving again, though I didn't want it to. I tried to fight it, but my limbs were no longer my own. The pull was too strong. I felt it in my chest, like a rope tied to my heart, yanking me forward. I stumbled outside into the cold, the darkness enveloping me like a suffocating blanket. The fog had thickened again, swirling around me, hiding the ground beneath my feet. The boat loomed out of the mist, closer now, almost too close. The figures on board were waiting. They were looking at me, their empty eyes burning into mine. And that was when I knew the lake would claim me too. I stepped forward, my feet moving of their own accord, toward the boat, toward the figures, toward whatever awaited me in the fog. The last thing I felt was the cold. The cold of the lake, of the fog, of the deathly silence. And then everything went dark. It's cold here. And the fog never lifts. The darkness was thick, like a suffocating blanket pressing down on me. My mind was clouded, fragmented, but there was one thing I knew with absolute certainty. I was not alone. The lake, the figures, they were all around me, lingering in the thick, oppressive fog. I could feel their presence, their cold, empty gaze fixed on me, even though I could see nothing. I tried to move, to break free from the suffocating grip of the fog, but my legs felt like they were weighed down with stone, and every step was an agonizing struggle. The air around me was damp and frigid, and the silence was so deep it felt like it could swallow me whole. Then, just as I thought I might collapse, I heard it. A whisper. It was soft at first, like a distant breeze rustling through the trees. But as it came closer, it became more distinct, an unnatural, guttural voice, hollow and cold, as if it came from beneath the water itself. "You're not leaving," the voice whispered, its tone slow, deliberate, and filled with malice. "This is where you belong." I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. The voice seemed to come from all around me, echoing in the fog. I couldn't tell if it was real or just a figment of my terrified mind. I wanted to scream, to fight back, but my throat was parched, the words caught in my chest. The fog thickened, swirling around my body like fingers of cold, pulling me deeper into the void. And then, through the haze, I saw it. The boat. It had reappeared, floating silently just a few feet away, the figures on board as still as statues, watching me with those unblinking, soulless eyes. They were waiting, patient and unyielding. The boat was no longer a distant silhouette. It was here, within my reach, and I knew, deep down, that there was no escaping it. No escaping them. I took a step back, but my feet wouldn't obey. The pull, the cold, the fog, it was all closing in on me. I felt as if the very air around me was thickening, tightening like a noose around my neck. Suddenly, I was no longer alone in the fog. The figures were there, behind me, their presence overwhelming. I could hear their footsteps, slow and deliberate, the sound soft against the damp earth, yet unmistakable. I turned around, but there was nothing. No one. Only the suffocating darkness and the fog that refused to lift. The figures were everywhere, invisible but present. Watching. Waiting. I tried to run, to break free, but my legs wouldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, the weight of the fog pressing down on me like an unbreakable chain. Then, just as I thought I couldn't bear it any longer, I heard the whisper again. This time, it was louder, clearer, and unmistakable. It was as if it was coming from the boat, from the depths of the lake itself. You should have never come, the voice crooned, its tone a twisted mockery of warmth. Now you're ours. Forever. And just like that, I was falling. The ground disappeared beneath my feet, and I felt myself being pulled into the water, the cold lake swallowing me whole. The figures were there, their hands reaching for me, pulling me into the depths. I tried to scream, but the water filled my mouth, choking me, drowning me in darkness. And then, everything went silent. I don't know how much time passed. Hours? Days? It didn't matter. All I knew was that I was still here, still trapped, still a part of the lake. The boat, the figures, the fog, they were all a part of me now. And as the final whisper echoed in my ears, I understood. I had become one of them. The lake had claimed me, as it had claimed so many others before me. And as I sank deeper into the cold, suffocating water, I knew there would be no escape. Only the endless, chilling embrace of the fog. Forever. Sinister Trail in New Hampshire. It was supposed to be a simple hike. The weather was perfect, with a crisp breeze swirling through the trees and the sun dipping low enough to paint the forest in warm, golden hues. I had been to New Hampshire several times before, but this was my first time on this particular trail. They called it the Whispering Path, and I had heard stories about it, stories that spoke of strange figures seen walking among the trees, their silhouettes barely visible through the thick fog that often rolled in after sunset. But those were just stories, right? My friends had laughed it off. Just another spooky legend, they said. Nothing to worry about. As I laced up my boots and made my way into the dense woods, I tried to brush away the unease that settled in my stomach. There was a strange feeling in the air, like something was watching me. I dismissed it as the typical nerves you get when venturing into unfamiliar territory. The path ahead twisted and turned through the trees, leading deeper into the heart of the forest. Birds sang in the distance, and leaves rustled underfoot, but there was something off about the silence that followed. At first, it was subtle. Just a flicker in the corner of my eye, a shadow moving against the flow of the wind. I told myself it was nothing, maybe a deer or some other animal. But the further I walked, the more I felt that unsettling sensation, like I wasn't alone. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was trailing me, always just out of sight. I stopped for a moment, trying to calm my nerves. The forest was quiet now, the normal sounds of wildlife absent. The leaves no longer rustled, and the birds had gone silent. It was as if the whole forest was holding its breath, waiting for something. I glanced over my shoulder, expecting to see nothing but the empty trail behind me. But that's when I saw it. A figure, standing just beyond the edge of the trees, barely visible in the dimming light. It was tall, cloaked in shadow, and though I could not make out any specific features, I could feel its gaze on me, cold and unblinking. My heart skipped a beat. I took a step back, my breath catching in my throat. But when I blinked, the figure was gone, as if it had never been there at all. A shiver ran down my spine, but I rationalized it. Maybe it was just my imagination, or perhaps another hiker who had taken a different path. I tried to push the thought away and continued walking, though now the path seemed longer, darker. The sun was nearly gone, casting a deep orange glow over the treetops. I glanced at my watch and realized I had been walking for longer than I had intended. The trail was starting to look unfamiliar, the trees growing thicker, their branches twisted and gnarled. I knew I should turn back, but something inside me urged me to keep going, to find out what lay at the end of the trail. And that's when I heard it. A soft whisper. Faint, but unmistakable. I froze. The whisper came from the woods around me, like a voice carried on the wind. It wasn't clear at first, just a series of unintelligible murmurs. Then, as if the wind itself was shaping the words, I heard a single sentence, whispered just behind my ear. Don't turn around. The words sent a jolt of terror through my body. My breath quickened, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. I wanted to scream, to run, but my feet felt frozen to the ground. The whisper continued, now louder, as if the voice had moved closer. You're not alone. They are watching. I spun around, heart racing, expecting to see something, anything, behind me. But there was nothing. The path was empty, the trees silent once more. My mind screamed at me to run, but I forced myself to take another step forward, my legs shaking beneath me. I didn't look back again. The whispering grew louder as I walked, echoing in my ears, filling the air with an unsettling chill. Each step I took felt heavier, like something was pulling me deeper into the woods. And then I saw it again, the figure. This time, it was much closer, standing just off the trail, its outline barely visible through the thickening fog. I tried to convince myself it was a trick of the light. I had to be imagining things. But the feeling of being watched, of being hunted, only intensified. I could feel the figure's eyes on me, cold and unfeeling, its presence seeping into my very bones. I kept walking faster now, my breath shallow, my pulse racing. The trail seemed to stretch on forever, the fog thickening with each passing moment. My mind was a whirlwind of thoughts, none of them making sense. Was I hallucinating? Was I lost? Or was something truly out there, following me? And then, just as I thought I couldn't take it anymore, I heard footsteps behind me. Slow. Deliberate. Closer. I spun around, heart hammering in my chest, but the path was empty. Nothing but the swirling fog and the creeping trees. But I knew something was there. And it was getting closer. I couldn't breathe. My lungs burned, my legs felt like lead, yet I kept moving forward, faster now, my mind spiraling out of control. The forest around me seemed to close in, the trees leaning inward, their branches like skeletal hands reaching out to grab me. The whispers were louder now, no longer just in the air, but seeping into my very thoughts, mingling with my panic. Don't run, The voice seemed to say, a soft, cold tone that made my skin crawl. You can't escape. I stumbled, nearly tripping over a root, and had to steady myself against a tree. My hands were slick with sweat, my heart thudding in my chest like a drum. My eyes darted around, desperately searching for any sign of life, any other person who might be near. But the trail was empty. No hikers. No one. It was as if the whole world had vanished, leaving me alone in the suffocating silence of the woods. My mind raced. Could this be real? Could this be happening? I tried to rationalize, telling myself it was just exhaustion, that I was imagining things. But deep down, I knew the truth. I wasn't alone. I wasn't sure how much time had passed, but it felt like hours since I first heard the whisper. The fog had thickened, swirling around me in ghostly tendrils, hiding everything beyond a few feet. The trees seemed to grow more twisted, their gnarled branches reaching down like fingers, scraping the air with an eerie screech. I had to find the way out. I had to get back to the road. But the path seemed to change with every turn. Every direction I took only led me deeper into the woods. The familiar landmarks were gone, replaced by strange, indistinct trees, their trunks bent unnaturally, their leaves rustling in an unnatural rhythm. I felt like I was walking in circles, trapped in some nightmarish loop. Then I heard it again, those footsteps. Slow, deliberate. Right behind me. I dared not look back. I couldn't. The thought of seeing that figure, of seeing whatever was following me, was too much to bear. But I could feel it, closing in on me. Its presence was suffocating, like a dark shadow that clung to my every step. It was real. Whatever it was real. A cold gust of wind brushed against my face, making me shiver. The fog swirled tighter, and in the brief moment of clarity, I thought I saw something, a figure, barely visible in the haze, moving alongside me. I gasped, my throat dry, but I couldn't scream. The figure was still there, following me at the edge of the path. Every time I tried to look directly at it, it would vanish into the fog, only to reappear in the corner of my vision moments later. I quickened my pace, my breath coming in short gasps. My thoughts were a jumbled mess. Was it real? Was I losing my mind? Or was this some kind of twisted game? I heard the voice again, louder now, as if it was right behind me. Don't run, you can't escape. I wanted to scream, to shout, but my voice caught in my throat. My feet were moving faster than I could control, like my body was acting on its own. I wasn't sure how much longer I could keep going. I didn't know where I was anymore. But then, through the fog, I saw something, a shape, familiar in its silhouette. A clearing. The end of the trail. I pushed myself harder, my legs burning as I ran, the sound of my footsteps echoing in the stillness. The fog seemed to thin, the trees parting as if to let me through. I could see the faint outline of the road ahead, the promise of safety just beyond the trees. And then I heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind me. I spun around, expecting to see it, whatever was chasing me. But there was nothing. Nothing but the empty trail and the thick fog, swirling like a living thing, as if mocking me. I took a step forward, then another. I could see the road now, just a few yards away. I was almost there. I was going to make it. But as I moved, I felt it, a cold hand, brushing against the back of my neck. I froze, my blood turning to ice. Slowly, I turned around. And there it was. the figure. Standing right behind me, just a few feet away, staring at me with eyes that seemed to pierce straight through me. It was tall, its body shrouded in darkness. Its features were indistinct, like smoke swirling around a faint silhouette, but its eyes, those eyes, were unmistakably real. They glowed with an otherworldly light, cold and unfeeling. And as I looked into them, I felt something in me break. It was as if time itself had stopped. The world around me seemed to disappear, the road, the trees, the very air. The only thing that remained was the figure, its eyes locked onto mine, unblinking, unfeeling. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone. I stood there, trembling, unable to move, unable to think. My legs finally gave way, and I collapsed to the ground, my body shaking uncontrollably. I didn't look back again. I couldn't. I stumbled toward the road, my heart still racing, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The fog was beginning to lift, but the feeling of being followed, of being watched, stayed with me. I reached the road, my mind reeling, but when I looked around, when I looked down the path I had just walked, I saw something that made my stomach drop. The trail, it was gone. Where the path had once been, there was only thick, impenetrable forest, stretching endlessly in every direction. No trail. No way out. I had escaped. But had I really? Or had I just stepped into something much worse? The air was thick with an unsettling silence as I stood at the edge of the road, my chest heaving from the exertion. The forest before me looked unchanged, its trees standing like silent sentinels in the growing dusk. But something felt wrong, too wrong. I could feel the eyes of the woods on me, as though the very trees themselves were watching. The sense of being followed, of being hunted, gripped me again. I didn't know what was worse, the fact that I made it out of the woods or the fact that something inside me told me I hadn't escaped. Not really. I turned around, slowly, hoping that what I saw was just another figment of my exhausted mind. But the clearing, the path I just fled from, wasn't where I'd left it. The thick fog had returned, curling up from the forest floor, surrounding the trees in an eerie haze. The faint outline of the trail that had led me out was now obscured, lost in the mist. I reached for my phone, hands trembling, hoping for some sign of civilization. But of course, there was no signal. The usual no-service message flickered in and out on the screen, mocking me. My throat felt tight, and my breath caught. I didn't want to go back into that forest, but I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever I had seen, whatever had followed me, was still there. As I stood there, frozen, I heard the softest sound, a faint rustling in the leaves. My heart skipped a beat, and I quickly turned toward it, hoping it was just an animal or a breeze. But the rustling continued, becoming louder, like footsteps, or something more deliberate. I squinted through the fog, straining to see. And then, in the distance, I saw them. Figures. Shadows. They were moving between the trees, stepping in sync, like they were pacing the perimeter of the clearing. There were at least 5 of them. Maybe more. Each one was cloaked in shadow, their faces hidden, their movements slow and deliberate. As I stared at them, a chilling realization sank in. They weren't moving like people. Their motions were unnatural, too stiff, like marionettes pulled by invisible strings. I took a step back, instinctively wanting to flee, but my feet were rooted to the spot. My throat tightened as the figures moved closer, their presence growing more overwhelming with each step. The rustling grew louder, and in that moment, I knew, whatever they weren't human. Please, I whispered, more to myself than to them. Please, Let me go. Let me leave. The fog around me thickened, swirling like a storm. The figures were almost upon me now, and I could hear the faintest whisper in the air. It was a sound that wasn't words, just a breathless, airy sound, like a chant. Something deep, ancient, and unsettling. One of the figures moved closer, its shape becoming clearer, though its face remained hidden in shadow. I wanted to run, to scream, but my body was frozen, locked in place by fear. The figure came to a stop in front of me, its presence overwhelming, its gaze piercing through the fog. Though I couldn't see its eyes, I felt its gaze like an icy hand gripping my chest. And then, just as quickly as they had appeared, the figures vanished into the mist, leaving nothing but the eerie quiet of the night behind. I stood there, trembling, unsure if I should move. The sound of my breath was the only thing I could hear. What were they? Why had they appeared? My mind raced with questions, but nothing made sense. I turned around, looking back toward the road, the place I thought would be safe. But the road, it was different. It wasn't the same. The ground was uneven now, covered with a thick layer of fog, as though the earth itself had shifted beneath me. And then, the whispers returned. Faint at first, like a distant hum. But they grew louder, circling around me, filling my head with 1,000 voices, all speaking at once. You can never leave. You never truly leave. I stumbled backward, my heart pounding in my chest. The words felt like a weight on my soul. The trees, the fog, the figures, they weren't just manifestations of my fear. They were real. They were always there, waiting, watching, following. I didn't know how much longer I could stand it. I wanted to run, but the path before me was now as uncertain as the one behind me. The forest had swallowed me whole, and there was no way out. I turned back to the road, desperate for something familiar. Anything to make sense of this nightmare. But even as I looked, the fog closed in tighter, blurring everything around me. Suddenly, I felt a presence, a cold breath against my neck. A whisper in my ear. You've already seen too much. I didn't need to look to know what it was. I could feel it. I could feel the shadows creeping closer, surrounding me. I was trapped. And that's when I heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps again, but this time they weren't behind me. They were right beside me. I didn't dare look. In the distance, just beyond the fog, I could see something now, a shadow, taller than the rest. And at the very edge of my vision, I saw the faintest outline of a figure, a woman, standing at the edge of the trees. She was motionless, her dark eyes staring at me, her hands twisted in the shape of claws. And before I could scream, the world around me went dark. I awoke to the soft, almost imperceptible sound of wind through the trees. My head was spinning, disoriented. I couldn't tell how much time had passed or even if I had been unconscious for a few seconds or hours. All I knew was that I was still in the same place. The fog, that thick, suffocating mist, was still clinging to the air, swirling around my feet and making the trees appear like looming giants. The forest hadn't changed, and neither had the oppressive weight of the silence. I tried to push myself up, but my legs felt weak. I was trembling. I wiped my hand across my face, trying to clear the fog that had settled in my mind. Everything was unclear. The whispering voices, the figures, the cold breath against my neck, they were all real. But they felt distant now, as if they were still part of a dream I couldn't escape from. The woman, she was still there. the one I had seen in the distance. I didn't dare look directly, but I could feel her presence in the periphery of my vision, like a shadow just beyond the light. Every time I turned my head, the fog would part, just enough to reveal that dark, twisted figure standing at the edge of the trees, watching me. I felt the pull of the forest again, a strange, magnetic force drawing me toward the shadows. But I didn't want to go back. Not after everything that had happened. My body screamed for me to run, but I couldn't move. It was like I was rooted to the ground, as if the forest itself was holding me here. The whispers started again. Louder now. Angrier. You cannot leave. Not now. Not after you've seen us. I clenched my fists, trying to silence the voices, but they just got louder, drowning out all other sounds. I looked around frantically. I needed to find an escape. The path that had once led me out was now completely consumed by the fog, indistinguishable from the rest of the forest. There was no way to tell where I had come from or where I was supposed to go. And that's when I heard it. A sound that made my blood run cold. A low growl, like an animal or something worse, just behind me. My heart pounded in my chest. I knew I wasn't alone. I turned around, but there was nothing. Just the same oppressive fog and the twisted trees. The growl came again, this time closer, and I spun around in panic, trying to pinpoint the source. But I couldn't see anything. I could feel the ground shifting beneath me, almost as if the earth itself was moving, warping, changing in real time. The woman in the distance was still there. She hadn't moved. But her form was clearer now, more distinct. She was taller than I had first thought, almost towering, and her limbs stretched unnaturally. It was as if she had been stretched, distorted. The more I stared, the more I could make out of her long, skeletal fingers, her hollow eyes, the jagged smile that twisted across her face like something grotesque and wrong. She stepped forward. My stomach churned. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. I was frozen, rooted to the spot. I couldn't breathe. The growl came again, closer still, but I couldn't see its source. I could only hear it, closer and closer. It wasn't just an animal's growl. It was something else. Something human, but not. A new figure appeared, stepping out from the mist. Another shadow. Another face. But this one wasn't a woman. It was a man. His face was obscured, but the shape of his body was tall, thin, and twisted. I could make out his arms hanging unnaturally by his sides, bent at angles, as if his joints had been wrong from the start. He moved like a puppet, limbs jerking with every step he took, as if someone or something was controlling him. I staggered back. My breath quickened. I was surrounded. The woman and the man moved closer, coming toward me. And then, all at once, everything clicked into place. This wasn't just some random encounter. They weren't just shadows or ghosts or hallucinations. They were the guardians of the forest. The ones who stalked the strollers, the wanderers, the people who dared to walk the path of this cursed trail. And now, I had seen them. I had seen too much. You shouldn't have come, the voice whispered again, but now it wasn't in my ear. It was in my mind. It was everywhere, filling the space between every breath I took. We warned you. I was shaking. The figures were so close now I could almost touch them. They were mere inches from me, and yet I couldn't feel anything. No wind, no warmth. Just the crushing weight of their presence. I looked down at my feet, trying to focus on something, anything. That's when I saw it, the path. It was clear now, the fog swirling away as if it had never been there. A way out. A way home. But I knew it was a lie. I had been here before. The forest wasn't letting me go. I was trapped. As if reading my thoughts, the woman's face twisted into a smile, her hollow eyes gleaming. She raised her arm, and I could hear the distinct sound of cracking bones. Her long, bony fingers reached for me. "No," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "No. I won't go back." The growl came again, louder now, and the figures took one final step toward me, blocking the only escape. The last thing I heard before the darkness swallowed me whole was the woman's voice. "You never truly leave." The darkness was thick, a suffocating blackness that seemed to press against my chest, making it hard to breathe. I could feel the cold earth beneath me, but my limbs felt disconnected, like they didn't belong to me. I was sinking into the ground, into the forest, into something far deeper than I could comprehend. Where was I? How had I gotten here? The last thing I remembered was the figures, those twisted, broken shapes, coming closer, surrounding me. The woman's touch, her fingers outstretched like they were meant to drag me down. But now, there was nothing. No figures. No whispers. No growls. Just the heavy silence. I tried to sit up, but it felt as if the earth itself had clung to my skin, pulling me back down. Panic surged in my chest. My heart was pounding again, faster than before. My hands grasped at the ground, trying to pull myself up, but the soil seemed to move with me, resisting, holding me. I gasped for air, but there was none. The air felt thick, like it was made of something other than oxygen, something foul and suffocating. Suddenly, the fog returned, swirling around me. It felt alive, like it was trying to consume me. The temperature dropped, and I shivered violently. The dampness clung to my clothes, to my skin, freezing me from the inside out. Then I heard it again. A sound, far off in the distance. A rustling. Like footsteps crunching through leaves, but not quite. The sound was unnatural, too heavy, too rhythmic. I couldn't tell where it was coming from, but I felt its presence, closer, approaching. I wasn't alone. I struggled to stand, finally managing to push myself to my feet. My legs were unsteady, and I could barely hold myself upright. The fog closed in tighter around me, but there, through the thick mist, I saw a shape. A shadow. The man from before. The twisted one. He was standing just a few feet away, but his figure was distorted, stretched, like he was bending on himself. I could hear his breath, labored, uneven, and feel the weight of his gaze, even though his face was hidden in the darkness. His eyes were just two empty sockets in the blackness. I could feel the heat radiating from him, but it was a different kind of heat, one that chilled me to my core. "Why are you doing this?" I gasped, my voice cracking. "What do you want?" The figure didn't answer. Instead, it began to move, its movements slow and deliberate, like it was savoring my fear. I stumbled back, but my legs gave out beneath me, sending me crashing to the ground. I tried to crawl, to get away, but the ground was slick and unyielding, as if the forest itself was keeping me here, trapping me. The growl, that low, guttural noise, rumbled through the air again, louder now, shaking the ground beneath me. "You can't escape," the voice whispered again, not from the figure, but from everywhere. Inside my head. in my chest. My mind reeled, the whispers getting louder, overlapping each other, drowning out my thoughts. You're part of this now. There's no way out. I looked up, my heart hammering in my chest. The figure was closer, its presence overwhelming. It reached out a hand, its fingers bending at unnatural angles, but they didn't come for me immediately. No, it was waiting. It was waiting for me to realize something. To understand the truth. The fog thickened, swirling around me like a tightening noose. The ground began to shift again, the earth groaning under some invisible weight. I thought of the people I had seen in town before I came here. The locals who warned me. The ones who had said to stay away from this trail. Had they seen this too? Had they felt this same crushing presence? The forest wasn't just a place, it was a force, something old and unforgiving. It had claimed people before. It had claimed me. There was no escape. My breathing became shallow, my vision blurry. I felt the weight of the darkness pressing down on me, forcing me to stay here. My legs were frozen in place. I couldn't move. Couldn't run. The figure was now standing directly in front of me. Its hand hovered above my head, fingers twitching. Then, a voice, deep, hollow, like it had been spoken through centuries of decay, whispered in my ear. Your soul is ours. I felt a sharp, excruciating pain tear through my chest, as if my very essence was being pulled from me. The force was unbearable, like I was being torn apart from the inside out. I gasped, but no air would fill my lungs. The forest, the figures, the fog, it all blurred into one suffocating mass, swallowing me whole. And then, nothing. The demonic wolf of Colorado. Have you ever heard a sound so haunting that it seemed to seep into your bones, clinging to your very essence? That's how it began for me, on a quiet night in the Rocky Mountains, with the stars scattered above like fragments of shattered glass. I was standing by the campfire, its flames flickering weakly against the vast darkness of the wilderness. The sheep, usually restless even at night, were eerily quiet in their pen a short distance away. It was my second week working as a shepherd, and though the isolation was daunting, I had grown fond of the mountain solitude. There was something ancient and untamed about the landscape, a presence that was both humbling and comforting. That night, however, the air felt different. Heavy. Charged. The first sound was so faint I almost missed it. A distant howl, carried on the wind, so low and mournful that it sent a shiver down my spine. I froze, straining to hear. The other shepherds had warned me about predators, coyotes, mountain lions, maybe even a rogue wolf, but this sound was unlike anything I'd ever heard. It was deeper, almost resonant, like it came from something larger than life. The sheep began to stir, their soft bleats breaking the stillness. I grabbed my flashlight and rifle, trying to shake off the unease that was creeping into my thoughts. It's nothing, I muttered to myself, forcing a shaky laugh. Just the wind. But as I approached the pen, the sheep were huddled together in a tight, trembling mass, their eyes wide and glassy in the dim light. A chill ran through me, not from the cold, but from the collective fear radiating off the animals. I had never seen them like this. Then, I saw it. A shadow moved just beyond the tree line. At first, I thought it might be a bear. Its size and posture suggested something massive. But when I aimed the flashlight at it, the beam caught two glowing red eyes staring back at me. I froze. Those eyes weren't natural. They weren't the reflected glint of an animal caught in the light. They were luminous, like embers smoldering in a fire. The figure stepped forward, just enough for me to make out its shape. It was a wolf, or at least, it resembled one. Its body was too large, its limbs unnaturally elongated, and its fur was blacker than the night around it, absorbing the light instead of reflecting it. The air seemed to grow colder with every passing second. I could feel my breath hitching, my pulse hammering in my ears. The creature didn't move closer. It just stood there, watching me, its eyes burning holes into my soul. I wanted to scream, to fire the rifle, to run. But my body wouldn't respond. I was paralyzed, held in place by those unholy eyes. And then it howled. The sound wasn't natural. It wasn't the mournful cry of a wolf or the sharp bark of a coyote. It was a guttural, bone-chilling wail that seemed to echo through the mountains, reverberating in my chest and stealing the air from my lungs. The sheep scattered, their terrified cries piercing the night. I finally managed to break free from my paralysis and raised the rifle, aiming directly at the creature. My hands were trembling, my vision blurred with panic. I fired. The crack of the shot shattered the silence, but the creature didn't flinch. It didn't bleed. It didn't retreat. It simply vanished. One moment it was there, solid and terrifying. The next, it dissolved into the shadows, leaving nothing but the lingering chill and the sound of my ragged breathing. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, the rifle still clutched in my shaking hands. The sheep had scattered into the night, their panic bleats fading into the distance. I was alone, surrounded by darkness and silence, with only the memory of those red eyes burned into my mind. As I stumbled back to the fire, my knees weak and my heart racing, I tried to rationalize what I had seen. A trick of the light? A hallucination? Some strange, oversized predator that didn't behave like it should? But deep down, I knew the truth. This was no ordinary wolf. And it wasn't finished with me. The morning light brought no comfort. I had barely slept, haunted by visions of those glowing red eyes. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard the howl again, low and guttural, like it was calling out to me from the void. When the other shepherds returned at sunrise, they found me sitting by the dying campfire, rifle across my lap. I must have looked as haggard as I felt because Caleb, the oldest of the group, squinted at me with concern. "You all right, kid?" he asked, his grizzled voice rough but not unkind. "I saw something last night," I said, my voice hoarse. "A wolf. Or at least, I think it was a wolf." At this, Caleb's face darkened. He glanced at the other two shepherds, who exchanged uneasy looks but said nothing. "What did it look like?" Caleb asked slowly. It was huge," I stammered. "Bigger than any wolf I've ever heard of. Its fur was pitch black, and its eyes, they glowed red. And when it howled, my voice trailed off as I struggled to find the words. It wasn't normal." Caleb's expression hardened. He crouched down beside me, his withered face inches from mine. "Listen to me, kid," he said in a low voice. "If you saw what I think you saw, you need to be careful. That thing isn't just some wolf. It's something else. Something this mountain doesn't want you to understand." "What do you mean?" I asked, my stomach twisting with unease. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he stood up, scanning the horizon as if expecting the creature to reappear at any moment. "Just stay close to the camp tonight," he said finally. "And don't go wandering off alone." The rest of the day passed in tense silence. We managed to round up most of the scattered sheep, though a few were missing entirely. The ones we found were skittish, refusing to settle even in the safety of the pen. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, though every time I looked around, there was nothing but the sprawling wilderness. That night, we built a fire higher than usual. Caleb insisted on keeping a watch rotation, and though I protested, he assigned me the first shift. The others retreated to their tents, leaving me alone with the crackling fire and the oppressive darkness beyond its glow. I gripped the rifle tightly, my eyes scanning the tree line for any sign of movement. The hours dragged by, and though my body ached with exhaustion, I forced myself to stay alert. Then, just as the fire began to die down, I heard it. A faint rustling in the bushes, followed by the soft crunch of footsteps on dry leaves. My pulse quickened as I raised the rifle, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure it would give me away. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice trembling despite my effort to sound firm. No answer. The footsteps grew louder, deliberate and slow, as if whatever was out there wanted me to know it was coming. I aimed the rifle toward the sound, my finger hovering over the trigger. And then, I saw them. Two glowing red eyes, just beyond the reach of the firelight. My breath caught in my throat. The creature didn't move closer this time. It simply stood there, watching me, its eyes burning like embers in the darkness. "Stay back," I shouted, but my voice cracked with fear. Still, it didn't move. Summoning what little courage I had left, I fired a warning shot into the air. The crack of the rifle echoed through the mountains, but the creature didn't so much as flinch. Instead, it let out a low, guttural growl that sent a chill racing down my spine. The sound was deep and resonant, vibrating through the air like a predator marking its territory. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the creature turned and vanished into the shadows. I didn't sleep that night. When Caleb took over the watch, I didn't tell him what I'd seen. I could barely bring myself to speak, let alone explain the terror that had gripped me. But deep down, I knew this wasn't over. The demon wolf wasn't just a creature of the night. It was hunting me. The next morning, the mountains were eerily quiet. Even the usual rustle of the wind through the pines seemed muted, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. The other shepherds noticed it too. Caleb muttered under his breath as he checked the pens, shaking his head at the scattered footprints and broken branches that marked where the sheep had panicked during the night. "Something's out there," he said finally. "You think it'll come back?" one of the younger men asked nervously. "It doesn't just leave," Caleb replied grimly. "It waits." I didn't tell them about the glowing eyes. I didn't need to. The tension in the air was thick enough to tell me they'd all seen or heard something strange over the years. Whatever this thing was, it wasn't new to them. As we set out to search for the missing sheep, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being followed. Every so often, I'd catch a flicker of movement out of the corner of my eye, a shadow slipping between the trees, too large and too fluid to be anything natural. "Did you see that?" I whispered to Caleb at one point, but he just shook his head. "Keep moving," he said. "And don't look back." His words sent a shiver through me. By midday, we found what was left of one of the missing sheep. The carcass was torn apart, its bones picked clean. The sight turned my stomach, but it was the tracks around the body that made my blood run cold. They were massive, far larger than any wolf prints I'd ever seen. But something was wrong with them. The shape was off, the claws longer and sharper, and the spacing between each step suggested a creature that moved with unnatural precision. "This isn't normal," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Caleb crouched down, examining the tracks closely. His face was grim when he finally stood. "No," he agreed. "It's not." We returned to camp as the sun began to dip below the horizon, the long shadows of the mountains stretching across the valley like dark fingers. That night, we fortified the camp as best we could, dragging fallen branches to form a makeshift barrier around the pens. "I'll take first watch," Caleb said, his voice brooking no argument. I didn't protest. My nerves were already frayed, and the thought of sitting alone in the dark again was almost too much to bear. But sleep didn't come easily. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those glowing red eyes staring back at me. The memory of the creature's growl echoed in my ears, a low, menacing rumble that seemed to vibrate through my very bones. Sometime after midnight, I awoke to the sound of Caleb's voice, low and urgent. "Get up," he hissed. I scrambled out of my tent, grabbing my rifle. The fire had burned low, casting long, flickering shadows across the camp. Caleb was standing near the edge of the clearing, his eyes fixed on something in the darkness. "What is it?" I whispered. He didn't answer. Instead, he pointed toward the tree line. And then I saw them. Not one, but two pairs of glowing red eyes, moving silently through the shadows. My heart pounded in my chest as the creatures stepped closer, their massive forms just barely visible in the dim light. They were larger than I'd imagined, therefore blacker than the night itself. Their eyes burned with a malevolent intelligence, and their movements were unnervingly deliberate, as if they were toying with us. "We're surrounded," Caleb said quietly. The other shepherds emerged from their tents, rifles in hand. No one spoke, but the fear in their eyes was clear. The creatures didn't attack. They just circled the camp, their glowing eyes never leaving us. Every so often, one of them would let out a low growl, a sound that seemed to shake the ground beneath our feet. It was a warning. "We can't stay here," Caleb said finally. "We need to move." "To where?" one of the others asked, his voice trembling. "They'll follow us no matter where we go." Caleb didn't respond. He just kept his eyes on the creatures, his grip on his rifle tightening. As the hours dragged on, the tension became unbearable. The creatures didn't come any closer, but their presence was suffocating. And then, just before dawn, they vanished. No sound, no movement, just gone, as if they'd never been there. But I knew better. This wasn't over. The following day, the camp was steeped in silence, the kind of silence that came from a collective understanding we were not safe. The wolves, or whatever they were, had shown us their power and their patience. The morning fog clung to the mountains as we prepared to move the flock to a safer location. Caleb took charge, directing the shepherds to gather the sheep quickly and efficiently. No one complained, but we all knew the futility of running from creatures that seemed to thrive in the dark. "Keep your eyes sharp," Caleb said, his voice low but commanding. "And stay close." I stuck to his side, my rifle gripped tightly. My hands were clammy, and every creak of a branch or rustle of leaves made my pulse race. The trail we followed wound through a narrow ravine, flanked by towering cliffs on either side. The sheep were uneasy, bleating nervously as they shuffled forward. The air felt heavier here, the kind of weight that pressed down on your chest and made it hard to breathe. "Do you feel that?" I asked Caleb. He nodded. "They're close." The others heard him and exchanged anxious glances, their grips tightening on their weapons. Then it happened. The first howl pierced the air, high and mournful, echoing off the cliffs and making the sheep scatter in panic. Caleb cursed, shouting orders as we scrambled to corral them, but it was no use. The flock broke apart, surging forward and backward in a chaotic wave. And that's when I saw it. One of the creatures leapt from the ridge above, landing in the center of the flock with an earth-shaking thud. It was even larger than I remembered, its black fur bristling and its red eyes glowing like embers. The sheep screamed, their cries cutting through the air as the beast tore into them with a ferocity that made my stomach churn. "Shoot it!" Caleb roared. The first gunshot rang out, shattering the paralysis that had gripped us. I raised my rifle and fired, the recoil jolting my shoulder. The bullet hit its mark, striking the creature square in the chest. But it didn't fall. It turned its head toward me, blood dripping from its jaws, and let out a guttural growl that made my knees buckle. Again, Caleb shouted. We fired in unison, the crack of gunfire echoing through the ravine. This time, the beast staggered, but it didn't retreat. Instead, it charged, its massive body moving with a speed that defied logic. I barely had time to react before it was upon us. Caleb shoved me aside, raising his rifle to fire one last shot before the creature slammed into him, sending him sprawling to the ground. "Caleb!" I screamed, scrambling to my feet. The others kept firing, their bullets tearing into the beast's flesh, but it refused to go down. It swiped at Caleb with one massive paw, and I heard him cry out in pain as blood sprayed across the rocks. Desperation took over. I grabbed a fallen branch and swung it at the creature's head with all my strength. The impact barely fazed it, but it was enough to draw its attention away from Caleb. "Come on!" I yelled, my voice trembling with fear and adrenaline. "Come after me!" The beast snarled, its eyes locking onto mine. For a moment, I thought it would kill me right then and there. But then it turned and bolted back into the trees, its massive form disappearing into the shadows as quickly as it had appeared. Silence fell over the ravine, broken only by Caleb's ragged breathing. I dropped the branch and rushed to his side, my hands shaking as I tried to assess his wounds. His shirt was soaked with blood, and deep gashes marred his chest and arms. "Stay with me," I said, my voice breaking. Caleb managed a weak smile. "You're not getting rid of me that easily." The others gathered around us, their faces pale and their eyes wide with fear. "What do we do now?" one of them asked. I didn't have an answer. All I knew was that this wasn't over. The beast had retreated, but it wasn't gone. It was waiting, watching, and the worst was yet to come. Night fell quickly in the mountains, and with it came the oppressive weight of dread. Caleb was alive, but barely. The deep gashes in his chest oozed blood despite our makeshift bandages. He was feverish, slipping in and out of consciousness as we huddled around the dwindling campfire. The others argued in hushed tones, their voices sharp with panic. "We have to leave him," one said. "If we stay, that thing will come back. We'll all die." "No!" I snapped, standing up. "We're not leaving him. If you're scared, go." "But I'm staying." The group fell silent, their faces a mixture of guilt and terror. No one moved. Above us, the wind howled through the trees, carrying with it an eerie sound that sent chills down my spine. It wasn't the wind. It was the howl of the creature, long and mournful, a promise that it was coming back. I clenched my rifle, the weight of it cold and heavy in my hands. If it comes for us again, we fight. We finish this. The others nodded reluctantly, their fear giving way to a grim determination. We set up a perimeter around the camp, piling rocks and logs into makeshift barricades. The fire was stoked high, its flames casting flickering shadows that danced on the cliffs around us. Every crackle of the fire, every rustle of leaves, made my heart race. Hours passed. The forest was eerily quiet, as if holding its breath. Even the sheep, what few of them remained, were still. Then it began. A low growl, deep and guttural, rumbled through the darkness. It was followed by the sound of something massive moving through the underbrush, snapping branches and crunching leaves. "Get ready," I whispered, raising my rifle. The others followed suit, their weapons trained on the shadows beyond the firelight. The growling grew louder, closer, until it was all I could hear. My hands trembled as I scanned the darkness, searching for any sign of movement. And then it appeared. The creature stepped into the firelight, its massive form towering over us. Its eyes burned like embers, and its fur was matted with blood. This time, there was no hesitation, no games. It was here to kill. "Fire!" I shouted. The first volley of gunfire lit up the night, bullets tearing into the beast's flesh. It howled in pain but kept moving, its massive body barreling toward us with terrifying speed. The barricade slowed it down, but only for a moment. With a single swipe of its claws, it sent the logs flying, scattering us like leaves in the wind. I hit the ground hard, the impact knocking the air from my lungs. Gasping, I scrambled to my feet and raised my rifle, firing blindly at the creature as it tore through the camp. It went for the others first, its jaws snapping and claws slashing. Their screams echoed through the night, chilling me to the bone. I turned to Caleb, who was still lying by the fire, too weak to move. The creature's eyes locked onto him, and it let out a snarl that made my blood run cold. "No!" I shouted, placing myself between Caleb and the beast. "You want him? You'll have to go through me." The creature lunged, its massive jaws snapping inches from my face. I fired again and again, the bullets tearing into its chest, but it didn't stop. Desperation took over. I grabbed a burning log from the fire and swung it at the creature, the flames searing its fur. It howled in pain and recoiled, giving me just enough time to grab Caleb and drag him away. "Run!" I screamed to the others, though I wasn't sure if any of them were still alive to hear me. The creature charged again, its red eyes blazing with fury. This time, there was no escape. It struck me hard, knocking me to the ground. My rifle skittered out of reach, and I was left defenseless as it loomed over me, its jaws open wide. But then it stopped. The creature's eyes flickered, its massive body trembling as it let out a low, guttural growl. It turned its head toward the forest, as if hearing something I couldn't. And then it was gone, disappearing into the shadows as quickly as it had come. I lay there, gasping for breath, my body trembling with fear and exhaustion. Caleb was still alive, but barely. The others. I didn't know. As the first light of dawn broke through the trees, I realized the truth. The creature hadn't left because it was defeated. It had left because it had won. We would never be safe. Not here, not anywhere. The demon of the mountains would always be watching, waiting, and it would return. This has been a long, dark journey through the night with Whisper Crowley. Thank you for staying with us until the end. Leave a like if these stories made you look at the darkness a little differently, and share in the comments what you enjoyed most or what gave you chills. Make sure to subscribe so you don't miss our next Sinister Whispers. Until we meet again in the world of shadows.